we are going to spend real time on the Younger Dryas, because virtually everything strange, unresolved, and genuinely debated about the civilization that vanished traces back to this single, roughly 1,200-year window of catastrophic climate collapse. It is the closest thing this story has to a crime scene, and like any good crime scene, the closer you look, the stranger the details become. But before we step into that collapse, we need to sit for a while in the world as it existed just before it, because to understand how much was lost, you first have to understand, patiently and specifically, what was there. Chapter 2: Life Before the Flood. Let's talk about who these people actually were, because Ice Age hunter-gatherers is a phrase that does a great deal of quiet damage to our imagination. It conjures something crude: small bands, short lives, no art, no thought beyond the next meal. The archaeological record, once you actually sit with it rather than skim it, tells a very different story. Consider Chauvet Cave in the south of France, sealed by a rockfall roughly 21,000 years ago and rediscovered only in 1994, sealed so completely that the paintings inside were preserved essentially untouched for over 20 millennia. What's inside is not crude. Panels of horses rendered with layered shading to suggest motion and depth, techniques art historians associate with much later, sophisticated traditions. Lions painted with an understanding of musculature and group behavior that suggests careful, repeated observation over years. Rhinoceros locked in what appears to be a deliberately composed battle scene. This is not decoration. This is intentional, skilled, symbolic image-making, made by people living through the depths of the last glacial period, in conditions we would consider nearly unsurvivable. Consider the Venus figurines, small, carved female forms found from Western Europe all the way to Siberia, spanning thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, with recurring stylistic features that suggest either shared cultural contact across vast distances or independent invention of remarkably similar symbolic language. Either explanation is remarkable. Either means Ice Age populations were exchanging ideas across a continent, or multiple separate groups converged on the same complex symbolic tradition independently. Both possibilities argue against the idea of isolated, static, incurious bands of survival specialists. Consider the flutes. At Hohlefels Cave in Germany, archaeologists recovered a flute carved from a griffon vulture's wing bone, radiocarbon dated to at least 35,000 years ago, predating the peak of the Ice Age by a wide margin, meaning musical tradition, presumably song, presumably some form of performance or ritual, was already old by the time the world we're discussing tonight existed at all. 50 meters below the surface of the Sea of Japan, off the southern coast of a small island called Yonaguni, a diver named Kihachiro Aratake cuts his engine and lets his boat drift. It is 1986. He has come here, as he does most mornings, to look for hammerhead sharks. The waters around Yonaguni are famous for them. Divers travel from across the world for a chance to see the seasonal gathering, hundreds of sharks moving through the current like a slow gray storm. But on this particular morning, Aratake does not find sharks. He finds a staircase. Not a natural rock formation that resembles a staircase if you squint and want it to. A staircase, wide, flat terraced steps descending in clean right angles, cut into what should have been ordinary seabed rock. Nearby, a flat plaza, a pillar, what looks, from certain angles, unmistakably like a road. He surfaces. He tells people. Nobody believes him at first, which is the correct response, because what he is describing should not exist. There is no record of any civilization building monuments in this part of the Pacific. And yet, the structure is there, has always been there, sitting quietly under the waves, while the world above it went on for thousands of years, assuming the ocean floor was simply the ocean floor. The formation is now known as the Yonaguni Monument. Depending on who you ask, it is either the most extraordinary archaeological discovery of the 20th century, or it is nothing at all. A striking but entirely natural sandstone formation, shaped by fracture lines that happen to look geometric to the human eye, which is very good at finding patterns, whether or not they are real. We are going to spend the next several hours somewhere in between those two positions, not chasing a myth, not dismissing one either. We are going to walk carefully through one of the strangest periods in the story of our species, the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, a period that the geological and archaeological record shows with total certainty involved catastrophic climate collapse, drowned coastlines, and the sudden, unexplained appearance of monumental architecture built by people history had assumed were still living in loose bands, chasing game, with nothing that could be called civilization at all. Something happened around 12,000 years ago. We do not fully know what, but we know enough now, genuinely, scientifically enough, to tell the story properly, for the first time, without the exaggeration and without the dismissal that usually surrounds it. Settle in. This is going to take a while to unfold properly, the way any story worth telling should. Chapter 1. The World That Drowned. To understand what may have vanished 12,000 years ago, you first have to understand what the world looked like before it vanished, and that world is almost impossible to picture correctly because everything about the map has changed. Today, when we picture the Ice Age, most of us picture something like a diorama in a natural history museum. Mammoths, glaciers, cavemen in furs, a scene of grinding, static cold. That picture is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously to this story. The last glacial period, technically the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, did not just make the world colder. It made the world smaller in the sense that mattered most to the people living in it. Sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today, because so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice sheets that in places were over 2 kilometers thick. Think about what 120 meters of lower sea level actually does to a map, because it is more dramatic than most people assume. The English Channel did not exist. Britain was not an island. It was a peninsula of continental Europe, and a landscape archaeologists now call Doggerland, a vast, low, river-threaded plain with forests, lakes, and its own wildlife occupied what is now the floor of the North Sea. People lived there, not passed through, lived there for generations, in a landscape that no longer exists in any form, submerged so thoroughly that fishing trawlers occasionally still pull up mammoth bones and, more chillingly, worked flint tools from waters 50 meters deep. The Persian Gulf was dry land, an enormous river valley fed by the Tigris, the Euphrates, and other now vanished waterways, extending far out into what is today open sea between Arabia and Iran. Some researchers believe this valley may have been one of the richest, most habitable environments in the entire region during the Ice Age. Well-watered, temperate, full of game, precisely because it sat in a rain shadow that would have made it a refuge while much of the surrounding land was too arid or too cold to support large populations comfortably.
Southeast Asia looked entirely different. The landmass now called Sundaland connected Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula into one enormous continuous continent, roughly the size of India, crossed by rivers whose old channels can still be traced on the seafloor by sonar. Some geologists and archaeologists, and we will return to this with real names and real papers later, not vague claims, have proposed that Sundaland may have been home to a substantial, sophisticated population before rising seas fragmented it into the scattered islands of modern Indonesia and the Philippines. And the coastlines themselves, everywhere, on every continent, sat in places we would now consider deep water. This is not speculative. This is measured, mapped, agreed-upon geology. The best, richest, most resource-abundant real estate on the Ice Age planet was almost certainly the coastline, for the same reason coastlines are valuable to humans today: access to fish, shellfish, migratory birds, fresh water where rivers meet the sea, and flat, fertile land. And virtually all of that Ice Age coastline is now underwater.
This single fact, so simple it is almost embarrassing that it took archaeology as long as it did to fully reckon with it, changes the entire shape of the question we are asking tonight. If the most desirable, most densely populated regions of the Ice Age world are now sitting under tens of meters of ocean, then the archaeological record we have excavated on land, the caves, the campsites, the scattered tools that formed our entire picture of primitive Ice Age humanity, may represent only the margins, the overflow, the territory nobody wanted enough to live on permanently, because the good land was closer to the water. We built our entire understanding of what people were capable of 12,000 years ago from what was left in the hills, while the coastal heartlands, where the real sophistication may have been developing, sat quietly drowned, undisturbed, essentially unexcavated, because you cannot dig where you cannot easily reach. This matters because of what happened next, and what happened next was not a gentle warming. The end of the Ice Age is usually described in textbooks with a kind of soft, linear language, as the climate warmed, as the glaciers retreated, language that implies a gradual, centuries-long thaw a person could adjust to across a lifetime. The actual data, pulled from ice cores in Greenland, from lake sediments in Europe, from cave formations in China, tells a very different story. The warming that ended the Ice Age happened in fits and starts, and at least twice it violently reversed, plunging the northern hemisphere back into Ice Age cold within what may have been a matter of years, not centuries, before resuming. The most dramatic of these reversals has a name you may or may not have heard before tonight, and it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. It is called the Younger Dryas. The longest-standing mainstream explanation involves freshwater. As the great ice sheets over North America, particularly the enormous glacial Lake Agassiz, a body of meltwater larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined, held back by a wall of ice, began to melt and eventually breached. An immense pulse of fresh, cold meltwater is believed to have flooded into the North Atlantic Ocean. Ocean circulation, particularly what's known as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the system of currents that carries warm water northward from the tropics, the same system that keeps modern Western Europe far warmer than its latitude would otherwise suggest, depends on a delicate balance of salinity and temperature to keep circulating. A massive influx of fresh, cold water could have diluted that salinity enough to stall the circulation, shutting off the flow of warm water northward and plunging the North Atlantic region back into cold, essentially by cutting off its heating system. This is a well-modeled, broadly accepted mechanism, and it remains the leading explanation in most geology and climate science circles.
But there is a second explanation, one that has moved from the fringes of the field into serious, published, peer-reviewed research over the last 2 decades. And it is the explanation that gives this story its sharpest edge. In 2007, a group of scientists, including physicist Richard Firestone, geologist Alan West, and a wider international team that would eventually grow to include dozens of researchers across multiple countries, published a controversial hypothesis, proposing that the Younger Dryas was triggered, or at least sharply intensified, by the impact or airburst of a fragmented comet or asteroid striking or exploding over the North American ice sheet, roughly 12,800 years ago. This has become known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it is worth walking through the actual evidence its proponents point to, rather than dismissing it out of hand, because whatever you conclude about it, the evidence itself is real, physical, and has been independently found at dozens of sites across at least 4 continents. The evidence includes a thin sediment layer, sometimes called the black mat, found at numerous archaeological and geological sites across North America, dated consistently to the very onset of the Younger Dryas, containing unusually high concentrations of materials associated with cosmic impacts, nanodiamonds, which form under the extreme pressure and heat of an impact event and are exceedingly rare in ordinary sediment. Microspherules of melted glass and metal, consistent with material vaporized and instantly re-solidified by extreme heat. Elevated platinum concentrations, since platinum is far more common in asteroids and comets than in the Earth's crust. And elevated levels of soot and charcoal, consistent with continent-scale wildfires occurring at precisely this boundary. Proponents of the hypothesis argue that an impact or series of airbursts over the North American ice sheet could explain multiple mysteries simultaneously: the abruptness of the Younger Dryas onset, the sudden extinction of most of North America's megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large species that had survived the entire preceding ice age only to vanish within this narrow window, and the equally sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture, the sophisticated stone tool-making people who, until this event, were the dominant human presence across North America. And consider, perhaps most tellingly, the burials. At Songir, in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered graves dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, containing 2 adolescents buried head to head, covered in an almost unbelievable quantity of ivory beads. Estimates suggest each burial involved thousands of individually carved beads, representing, by some calculations, thousands of hours of skilled labor invested in honoring the dead. This is not survival behavior. Nobody facing genuine, constant, marginal survival invests thousands of hours of a community's skilled labor into decorating a corpse. This is a society with surplus time, surplus resources, surplus attention, organized enough to dedicate real wealth to ritual, meaning, and grief. So, by the time we arrive at the world of 14,000 to 13,000 years ago, the world just before our story's central catastrophe, we are not talking about a species newly arrived at symbolic thought, art, music, or ritual. We are talking about a species that had already been doing all of these things in recognizable form for tens of thousands of years. What they had not yet done, as far as the conventional record shows, was build in stone, had not yet, as far as we knew until quite recently, constructed monumental architecture,
temples, cities, anything that required large-scale coordinated labor and long-term planning across generations. That assumption held, comfortably, for most of the 20th century.
Then, in the 1990s, in the rolling hill country of southeastern Turkey, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a low, unremarkable-looking hill the local farmers called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, a place they had been quietly plowing around for generations because it was covered in stone fragments too big and too awkwardly placed for their equipment. What Schmidt found underneath that hill did not just add a data point to the historical record, it broke the timeline that archaeology had relied on for a century.
Chapter 3: The Hill That Rewrote History. Here is the assumption Göbekli Tepe destroyed. And it is worth stating it plainly, because the destruction of an assumption this foundational does not happen often in any field of science. The assumption was this: monumental architecture requires agriculture. You cannot build large stone structures requiring dozens or hundreds of workers, organized over years, fed and housed and directed with some form of leadership, without a stable, reliable food surplus. And a stable, reliable food surplus requires farming. Hunter-gatherers, by definition, move. They follow the herds, follow the seasons, follow the water. They do not settle in one place long enough or accumulate enough surplus to build temples. Therefore, the logic went, agriculture came first, then villages, then surplus, then, only then, monuments, temples, and the beginnings of what we'd recognize as civilization. This sequence was taught, essentially unchallenged, in every introductory archaeology course for generations. It made intuitive sense. It fit the evidence available at the time. Göbekli Tepe is dated through multiple independent methods, including radiocarbon dating of organic material found in its construction fill, to approximately 9600 BCE, meaning it was built roughly 11,600 years ago, squarely in the window this story is concerned with, and by some estimates, its earliest phases may reach back even further, closer to the tail end of the Younger Dryas itself.
At that date, according to the conventional model, agriculture did not yet exist. The people who built Göbekli Tepe should, by every assumption the field had operated under, have been hunter-gatherers. And yet what they built is not a campsite, it is not a shelter. It is a series of large circular and oval enclosures, each ringed by T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing upwards of 10 tons, quarried from bedrock several hundred meters away, without wheels, without draft animals domesticated for the purpose, without metal tools, and moved, shaped, and erected with a precision that required sustained, organized, skilled cooperative labor across what was likely multiple human generations.
The pillars are not blank. Many are carved in relief with an entire menagerie of animals: foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, cranes, and, most strikingly, a series of figures that appear to combine human and animal characteristics, along with abstract symbols whose meaning is entirely lost to us. Some pillars are carved with what appear to be stylized human arms and hands, folded at the waist, as though the pillars themselves are meant to represent standing figures, ancestors, deities, or something we don't yet have a word for. Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavation until his death in 2014, came to describe Göbekli Tepe not as a settlement, but as the world's oldest known temple, a site built, he argued, specifically for ritual and gathering by groups who did not live there permanently, but who traveled from considerable distances, likely from multiple different hunter-gatherer bands, to build and use it collectively. If Schmidt is, and this interpretation, while debated in its specifics,
remains broadly influential, then Göbekli Tepe suggests something genuinely uncomfortable for the old model, that shared belief, ritual, and the desire to gather and build something meaningful together may have come before agriculture, before villages, before surplus. That religion, in some form, might be older than the farm.
Some researchers have gone further, proposing that the concentration of labor and resources required to feed the workers who built and gathered at Göbekli Tepe may itself have been one of the pressures that pushed nearby populations toward deliberate cultivation of wild grains, meaning the temple may not have been built because of agriculture. Agriculture may have been invented, in part, to sustain the temple. Cause and effect reversed from everything the textbooks assumed. Whether or not that specific reversal holds up under further research, and it remains actively debated among archaeologists working in the region, the larger point stands undisturbed. 11,600 years ago, in the hills of what is now Turkey, people we had assumed were still living in small, mobile, technologically simple bands were organizing on a scale and with a level of shared symbolic sophistication that nobody expected to find for another 6,000 years. And Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Within a relatively short distance, tens of kilometers, in the same region archaeologists now call the Taş Tepeler, or Stone Hills, a cluster of similar sites has since been identified: Karahan Tepe, Navali Chodi, Sefer Tepe, and others, some only partially excavated, some discovered as recently as the last few years, using ground-penetrating radar before a single shovel touched the soil. Karahan Tepe, in particular, has produced its own startling finds: a chamber containing a row of carved phallic pillars, and most remarkably, a large carved human head emerging directly from the bedrock floor, staring upward, connected to a stone pillar shaped like a body, as though the builders were carving a figure out of the earth itself, rather than building one on top of it. This is not one strange hill. This is a network, a cluster of monumental ritual sites, built by related, or at least communicating populations, spread across a region, constructed at a date that should not have permitted this level of organization at all. The question this leaves hanging in the air, and it is the question this entire documentary is built around, is simple to ask and very difficult to answer. If people were capable of this 11,600 years ago, what were they capable of 1,000 years before that, 2,000 years before that? What existed in the world before the catastrophe that, as we're about to see, nearly ended everything? Chapter 4: The Night the World Froze Again. To understand what may have happened to whatever came before Göbekli Tepe, we need to talk properly about the Younger Dryas, not as a footnote, but as the central, violent event this entire story hinges on. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth was in the middle of warming out of the Ice Age. Glaciers were retreating, sea levels were rising, though still far below today's levels. The climate, after millennia of brutal cold, was becoming livable in new places, and the human populations of Europe, Asia, and the Americas were adapting to that warming, following retreating ice northward, settling new territory, adjusting hunting patterns to newly available game. And then, according to the ice core and sediment record, it stopped, abruptly. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged back toward full Ice Age conditions, and the speed of this reversal is what makes it so unsettling to sit with. Greenland ice cores, which record year-by-year snowfall chemistry with extraordinary precision, suggests that some of the sharpest temperature changes associated with the Younger Dryas onset may have occurred within a span of years to a few decades, not centuries. Glaciers that had been retreating for thousands of years began advancing again. Forests that had begun recolonizing northern Europe died back. In parts of the North Atlantic region, average temperatures may have dropped by somewhere in the range of 10 degrees Celsius or more within a human lifetime, possibly within a matter of years.
Try to sit with what that actually means for the people living through it, rather than just registering it as a number on a chart. A 10-degree drop in average temperature, sustained, is not a cold snap. It is the difference between a landscape that supports migratory herds, edible plants, and fishable rivers, and a landscape that has reverted, in the span of one generation's memory, to something closer to tundra. Rivers that had been running freely for centuries began to freeze over for parts of the year again. Herds that had adapted their migration routes to the warmer decades either died or moved, and the humans who depended on them had to move too, or starve, or both. This cold snap lasted, by most estimates, somewhere around 1,200 years, an entire era, not a season, not a decade, before ending, again abruptly, around 11,700 years ago, when temperatures spiked back upward and the warming that had been interrupted resumed, this time more or less permanently, carrying the world into the relatively stable, warm climate period we still live in today, known as the Holocene. Now, what caused the Younger Dryas to begin and what caused it to end remains one of the genuinely open, actively contested questions in Earth science, and it deserves to be presented honestly with the actual competing theories, rather than flattened into a single dramatic answer.
This finding, published by researchers including Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed in the 2010s, forced a genuine reconsideration within parts of the anthropological community regarding just how long and how accurately purely oral cultures can transmit specific factual information across generations, provided the information is tied to something communities have strong cultural reason to keep retelling accurately: sacred law, ancestral land, ceremonial obligation. So where does that leave us with the flood myths of Gilgamesh, of Manu, of Deucalion, of Yu the Great?
It leaves us in a genuinely open, genuinely interesting place. Not certainty, but not dismissal either. It is entirely plausible that these traditions, distributed as they are across cultures with no direct contact, independently encode fragmented, mythologized, but not entirely fictional memories of the actual, real, catastrophic sea level rise that occurred as the last ice age ended. A rise that happened, according to the geological record, not smoothly, but in a series of violent pulses, the most extreme of which, known to researchers as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago, and is estimated to have raised global sea levels by as much as 16 to 25 meters in as little as a few hundred years, a rate of coastal drowning fast enough that communities living through it, generation after generation, watching the shoreline creep inland within living memory, would have had every reason imaginable to encode that experience into their most sacred, most carefully preserved stories. It would explain, better than almost any other theory, why a flood, not a fire, not a famine, not a plague, but specifically a flood, became one of the most persistent, most widespread founding traumas in human mythology. Something was lost to the water. Whole landscapes, possibly whole ways of life built on those now drowned coastlines we discussed earlier, the rich, resource-abundant Ice Age shorelines that would have been the most desirable real estate on the planet and are now sitting, silent, dozens of meters below the surface of every ocean on Earth. And in at least a few remarkable, well-documented cases, we don't just have to imagine what might be down there. We've found it.
Chapter 6. What the Water Hid. Let's go back underwater, because this is where the story becomes physical again. No longer myth, no longer sediment chemistry, but actual structures sitting on the seabed that people have actually dived down and touched. We opened tonight with Yonaguni, and it's worth returning to it properly now, with more care than a cold open allows.
The Yonaguni Monument sits roughly 25 meters below the surface at its shallowest points, off the coast of Japan's southernmost inhabited island. It consists of a series of stepped, terraced formations cut into sandstone bedrock. Flat plazas, sharp right-angle edges, what has been described as a wide, straight channel resembling a road, and a formation some researchers have described as resembling a stone quarry, complete with look like tool marks and partially cut, never removed blocks. The core of the scientific disagreement over Yonaguni comes down to one specific, genuinely difficult geological question. Can natural processes alone produce right angles, straight edges, and stepped terraces this clean and this consistent? Masaaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus who has spent decades diving and studying the site, argues no, that the precision, consistency, and specific features he has documented, including what he interprets as carved characters, a possible carved animal relief, and what appears to be a man-made channel, are inconsistent with the natural fracturing patterns typically seen in sandstone of this type, and that the formation represents a deliberately shaped structure, potentially a temple or ceremonial site that would have been carved while the area was still above water, meaning if his interpretation is correct, it would date to at least 10,000 years ago based on when this specific shelf was last above sea level, and possibly considerably earlier. Other geologists, including Robert Schoch of Boston University, a figure we'll return to shortly in a different context, have dived the site and reached the opposite conclusion, that Yonaguni's sandstone is composed of natural, parallel bedding planes that fracture along predictable, often startlingly geometric lines, a phenomenon well documented in similar sandstone formations elsewhere in the world that have never been touched by human hands, and that what looks designed to the untrained or hopeful eye is in fact a product of the stone's own natural composition, doing what this particular type of rock reliably does when it erodes and fractures. Both of these are credentials-carrying geologists examining the same physical formation, reaching opposite, confidently stated conclusions. That tension has never been resolved, more than 3 decades after Aratake's initial discovery, and it likely will not be resolved without either far more extensive underwater excavation than has so far been permitted, or the discovery of a clearly artificial object, a tool, a fragment of pottery, cut stone debris, inconsistent with natural fracture, physically associated with the site in a way that removes ambiguity. We are telling you this not to leave you unsatisfied, but because the honest state of the evidence is more interesting than a false certainty in either direction would be. Yonaguni remains genuinely an open question, one of a small number of archaeological mysteries in the world today, where trained experts looking at identical physical evidence disagree this fundamentally about whether they are looking at architecture or geology. Yonaguni is not alone in this category, and this is worth knowing, because it changes how isolated the mystery feels. In the Gulf of Cambay, also called the Gulf of Khambhat, off the coast of Gujarat in western India, marine researchers conducting a pollution survey in 2001 using sonar picked up geometric structures on the seabed at a depth of around 40 meters, in an area covering several square kilometers. Subsequent dredging operations reportedly recovered artifacts,
including what were described as wooden fragments and pottery-like objects, some of which were sent for radiocarbon dating, with certain samples reportedly returning dates in the range of 9,500 years old, though it's important to state clearly that these dredged findings have faced substantial methodological criticism from archaeologists, who point out that dredged material can easily become mixed with debris of entirely unrelated ages, and that no controlled peer-reviewed excavation has been permitted at the site to properly verify the initial claims. The Indian government's Marine Archaeology Center has continued periodic survey work, and the site remains, in the scientific literature, a genuinely unresolved and actively disputed claim rather than a confirmed discovery. But it is a claim taken seriously enough by some researchers to warrant continued investigation, which is itself notable. In the waters off Alexandria, Egypt, in an entirely different and far better documented category, French archaeologist Franck Gaudiot spent years mapping the submerged ruins of what turned out to be two entire ancient cities, Thonis Heraklion and Canopus, cities that appear in ancient Greek and Egyptian records as real, functioning ports, later lost beneath the waters of Abukir Bay through a combination of rising sea levels, land subsidence, and probable earthquake and tsunami damage sometime around the 8th century CE. This is not a contested fringe claim. Gaudiot's team has recovered thousands of artifacts, colossal statues, temple foundations, coins, ships, and it stands as concrete, physical proof that entire cities, complete with harbors, temples, and populations, absolutely can and did vanish beneath the sea within recorded historical memory, dramatically more recently than the Ice Age flooding we've spent the last hour discussing, but serving as an important reminder, this is not a hypothetical process. The sea swallowing cities is not myth. It is documented, repeated, provable history, and it has happened again and again at different scales throughout the entire span of human civilization.
It is important, in the interest of giving you the full and honest picture, rather than a one-sided one, to say clearly, this hypothesis remains contested. A number of geologists and archaeologists have published counter-analyses questioning whether the nanodiamonds and microspherules found at these sites are truly impact diagnostic, or whether they could form through other, more mundane processes, wildfires, volcanic activity, or even contamination during sample handling. Some of the original research has faced serious methodological criticism, and several attempts to independently replicate specific findings have produced mixed results. This is, genuinely, still an open scientific argument, playing out in real time, in real journals, between serious researchers on both sides. We are not going to pretend otherwise tonight.
But here is what is not seriously disputed by either side of that argument. Something happened, abruptly, around 12,800 years ago. The climate reversed catastrophically. Megafauna across an entire continent went extinct within a geological eye blink. An entire established human culture disappeared from the archaeological record at almost exactly the same moment. And whatever caused it, a comet, a meltwater pulse, or some combination of causes acting together, which is increasingly the position many researchers now favor rather than treating it as an either-or question, the world that emerged on the other side of that 1,000-year cold snap was fundamentally, permanently different from the world that entered it.
And somewhere in that transition, in the chaos of a rapidly cooling, then rapidly warming, then catastrophically flooding world, as the last of the Ice Age glaciers finally permanently gave way and sea levels rose by tens of meters over the following millennia, something else happened, something that shows up not in ice cores or sediment layers, but in the oral traditions of nearly every human culture on Earth. They all, independently, remember a flood.
Chapter 5: The Flood That Everyone Remembers. There is a peculiar, uncomfortable fact sitting at the center of world mythology, one that gets mentioned often but rarely sat with properly, and it deserves proper attention here. Flood narratives, stories describing a catastrophic, world-altering deluge that destroys most of humanity, usually surviving only through a small group warned in advance, appear independently in the mythological traditions of cultures with no plausible contact with one another, separated by oceans, by thousands of years, by entirely unrelated languages and belief systems.
The most familiar version to Western audiences is the biblical account of Noah, but that account is itself demonstrably a later retelling of an older Mesopotamian tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature on Earth, written in cuneiform on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia, contains an extended flood narrative, the story of Utnapishtim, warned by a god to build a great boat, load it with his family and the seed of all living creatures, before the gods unleash a flood that destroys the rest of humanity. Scholars have traced this story back further still, to an even older Sumerian flood myth involving a king named Ziusudra, and to the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, suggesting a flood tradition already old, already being retold and adapted by the time the very first written records of human civilization began. But the pattern does not stop at Mesopotamia, and this is the part that should genuinely give you pause. In Hindu tradition, the Matsya Purana and other texts describe Manu, warned by a fish, later revealed to be the god Vishnu in a fish avatar, of an approaching deluge that will destroy the world, instructed to build a boat and gather the seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. In Greek mythology, Deucalion, son of Prometheus, is warned by his father of an impending flood sent by Zeus to end an age of humanity grown corrupt, survives with his wife Pyrrha in a chest, and the two of them go on to repopulate the earth. In Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiché Maya, describes an earlier age of humanity destroyed by a great flood before the current age of humans was created. Aztec tradition similarly describes previous suns or ages, one of which ends in catastrophic flooding. In China, traditions surrounding the mythical Emperor Yu the Great center on his efforts to control a catastrophic flood that had ravaged the land for years, a flood so central to Chinese cultural memory that Yu's success in taming it is treated as the founding act that legitimizes the beginning of organized Chinese civilization itself. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, some of which have been studied by researchers for evidence of extraordinary historical durability, more on that shortly, include flood narratives tied to specific identifiable geographic features, describing coastlines and landmarks that match locations now known through modern sea level reconstruction to have been dry land during the Ice Age and submerged as seas rose. Norse mythology describes a primordial flood of blood from the slain giant Ymir, in which all but one giant and his family drown. Traditions among numerous Native American nations, the Hopi, the Choctaw, tribes throughout the Pacific Northwest, include flood narratives, often tied to specific creation or renewal stories. Similar accounts appear in West African, Polynesian, and Southeast Asian oral traditions. Now, it would be intellectually dishonest to present this simply as proof of one single global flood event remembered identically by every culture on Earth. Floods are, after all, one of the most universal natural disasters a human community can experience, and it is entirely possible, many folklorists and anthropologists would argue likely, that many of these traditions arose independently,
describing local floods that were catastrophic to the specific community that experienced them, later elaborated and mythologized over centuries of retelling, with recurring structural elements, a warning, a vessel, survivors, a renewal, simply because those are the most narratively satisfying and memorable ways to tell a survival story, regardless of what specific event inspired it. But there is a more careful, more interesting version of this question that serious researchers have begun asking, one that moves beyond, did everyone remember the same flood, and toward a more precise question, could oral tradition actually preserve accurate memory of real environmental events across thousands of years? This question has an answer, and the answer is more remarkable than most people expect.
Researchers studying Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, working with communities along Australia's coastline, have documented stories describing specific locations that are now underwater, describing them in ways consistent with what those locations would have looked like as dry land before sea level rise submerged them. When these stories have been cross-referenced against modern bathymetric mapping, precise measurement of the seafloor, the described coastlines and landmarks correspond, in several documented cases, to coastal configurations that existed between 7,000 and, in some analyses, as much as 10,000 or more years ago, before subsequent sea level rise drowned them. That is not a story surviving for a few centuries through careful retelling. That is a specific, geographically verifiable memory, potentially preserved through oral transmission alone, across a span of time longer than the entirety of recorded Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or Chinese written history combined.
Chapter 9. The Question Carved into a Lion's Body. There is one more site that belongs in this conversation, and it may be the most contested of all, not because the structure itself is in doubt, but because of a single, specific, deceptively simple question about its surface. What actually weathered it? The Great Sphinx of Giza is, uncontroversially, ancient, monumental, and almost certainly linked to the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafre, based on its location relative to his pyramid and valley temple, and the broadly accepted mainstream Egyptological dating places its construction around 2500 BCE, making it a genuine, remarkable achievement of Old Kingdom Egypt and requiring no controversial reinterpretation at all to be one of the most extraordinary single sculptures on the planet.
The controversy was introduced by an unlikely figure, not an archaeologist, but a geologist, Robert Schoch of Boston University, the same geologist who dove Yonaguni and reached a skeptical conclusion there. In the early 1990s, Schoch examined the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure, the walls of the pit surrounding the statue, carved from the same bedrock, and argued that the specific pattern of erosion he observed, deep, rolling vertical fissures with rounded profiles, was inconsistent with the type of weathering produced by wind and sand, which was the erosion mechanism assumed under the standard dating. Instead, Schoch argued this specific pattern of erosion is far more consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy, sustained rainfall, precipitation-based weathering, of the kind Egypt has not experienced at meaningful levels since the end of a much wetter climatic period, thousands of years before the accepted construction date of the Sphinx. If Schoch's geological interpretation is correct, it would require the Sphinx enclosure to have been carved during a period when the Giza Plateau received substantially more rainfall than it does today, or has for the entirety of pharaonic Egyptian history, pushing the earliest carving of at least the enclosure and possibly the core body of the statue back to somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 5,000 BCE at minimum, and in some more extreme versions of the argument, considerably earlier still, into the tail end of the very period this documentary has spent hours discussing.
This proposal has been met with sustained, detailed, and largely negative response from the mainstream Egyptological and geological community. Critics, including geologist K. Lal Gori and others who have published direct rebuttals, argue that the specific weathering patterns Schoch identifies can also be produced by other mechanisms, fluctuating groundwater levels combined with the specific layered composition of the local limestone, which contains bands of varying hardness that erode unevenly through wind, humidity cycling, and salt crystallization, even without direct heavy rainfall, and that other structures at Giza, confidently dated to the same 4th dynasty period as the Sphinx, through inscriptions and direct architectural continuity with Khafre's pyramid complex, show similar weathering patterns, which would be difficult to explain if that weathering required a rainfall period thousands of years earlier than those structures were built. There is also a broader archaeological objection that deserves to be stated clearly and fairly. If a sophisticated society existed in Egypt, capable of carving a structure on the scale of the Sphinx 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, the complete absence of any other supporting evidence from that period in the region, no comparable stone architecture, no corresponding settlement remains, no continuous tool-making tradition bridging that era to the Old Kingdom period thousands of years later, is difficult to reconcile with what we would expect from a genuinely established monument-building civilization. Cultures capable of this level of stoneworking rarely produce only one structure and then leave no other trace for millennia. So where does this leave the Sphinx water erosion question, presented honestly? It leaves it, like Yonaguni and like the deepest layers of Gunung Padang, in the category of a genuinely serious, credentialed, published scientific disagreement that remains unresolved. Not settled science being challenged by fringe theorists, and not a wild fringe theory being unfairly dismissed by a closed-minded establishment, but an actual open dispute between geologists about how to correctly interpret a specific, physical, observable pattern of stone weathering sitting in full public view in the Egyptian desert that anyone can go and look at for themselves. Schoch's core geological observations about the weathering pattern have not been comprehensively disproven, but neither has his interpretation of what caused it been broadly accepted by the wider community of geologists and Egyptologists who have examined the same evidence.
Which brings us to the largest, and by far the most scientifically debated of all the submerged civilization claims, one that isn't even primarily underwater at all, but buried beneath a hill in the highlands of West Java.
Chapter 7: The Buried Mountain of West Java. Gunung Padang is, on its surface, literally its visible surface, an unusually large, terraced megalithic site sitting atop a hill in the West Java highlands of Indonesia, consisting of 5 terraces connected by a long stone staircase covered in thousands of andesite columnar rocks, arranged in patterns that suggest deliberate human construction. It has been known to Western archaeology since Dutch colonial reports in the 1890s, and to local communities who regard it as a sacred site for far longer than that. On this much there is no controversy at all. It is a real, substantial, ancient megalithic monument, and it deserves to be far better known internationally than it currently is.
The controversy begins with what a team of Indonesian researchers, led by geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaya, claimed to find beneath it. Beginning in the mid-2010s, this team conducted a combination of ground-penetrating radar surveys, seismic tomography, and, critically, physical core drilling into the hill beneath the visible megalithic terraces. Based on this research, published most prominently in a 2023 paper in the journal Archaeological Prospection, the team argued that Gunung Padang is not simply a hill with megaliths placed on top of it, but a deliberately, artificially constructed multi-layered structure, built up in at least 3 distinct phases over an extraordinarily long span of time, with the deepest, oldest layer, based on radiocarbon dating of soil samples extracted from deep within core samples, potentially dating back as far as 25,000 to, in the most extreme estimate offered in the paper, possibly even older, extending towards the very edge of what carbon dating can reliably measure at all.
If this interpretation is correct, it would represent, by an enormous margin, the oldest known example of monumental construction anywhere on Earth, older than Göbekli Tepe by well over 10,000 years, built at a period when, according to every existing model of human technological and social development, organized large-scale construction should have been essentially impossible. This claim generated an extraordinary amount of attention and an equally extraordinary amount of pushback from the archaeological community, and it's important to walk through that pushback honestly, because it represents exactly the kind of rigorous scientific scrutiny that any claim this large should and did receive.
The central criticism, raised by multiple archaeologists in published responses and in a formal expression of concern issued by the journal itself in 2024, centers on the relationship between the dated soil samples and actual evidence of human construction. Critics argue that radiocarbon dating organic material found within layers of soil does not, by itself, prove that the surrounding soil layer was deliberately placed there by humans as part of a construction project. Natural geological processes, including volcanic activity and soil deposition common to this specific volcanic region of Indonesia, can produce layered soil structures that superficially resemble, but are not actually, artificial construction fill. In other words, dating old organic matter within a hill tells you the organic matter is old. It does not, on its own, tell you that people built the hill around it. That inferential leap from old material found within a layer to humans deliberately constructed this layer as part of a monument 25,000 years ago is precisely the leap that critics argue the original paper did not adequately support, and it is a serious, legitimate methodological objection, not simply reflexive gatekeeping.
Following the formal expression of concern, the journal's publisher launched a more extensive review, and the paper was ultimately retracted in early 2024. Not necessarily because its underlying field data was fabricated, but because, in the publisher's assessment, the interpretive leap from that data to the paper's headline conclusions had not been sufficiently justified or peer-reviewed to the standard required. Now, here is where it's important to resist two equally tempting, equally wrong reactions.
The first tempting but wrong reaction is to treat the retraction as proof that nothing unusual is happening at Gunung Padang at all, that it's simply an ordinary megalithic site, and the whole story was media hype. That's too dismissive. The visible terraces and megalithic construction are real, extensive, and impressive by any standard, and the deeper ground-penetrating radar and seismic data, separate from the most controversial radiocarbon interpretations, do appear to show subsurface cavities and layering that researchers, including some skeptical of the most extreme dating claims, agree merit further, more rigorous investigation.
The second tempting but wrong reaction is to treat the retraction as a cover-up, evidence of an archaeological establishment suppressing an inconvenient discovery because it threatens the existing timeline. That's too conspiratorial, and it misunderstands how the retraction actually happened, through open, published scientific criticism from named researchers, using the exact peer review mechanisms science is supposed to run on, precisely the process that is supposed to happen when a claim this large is made. A genuine cover-up does not typically involve the journal itself publicly walking through its reasoning in detail and inviting the original authors to respond.
The honest, unsatisfying, but scientifically accurate position is this: Gunung Padang is a real, substantial,
ancient megalithic monument that deserves continued serious study. Whether the deepest layers beneath it represent 25,000-year-old deliberate human construction, or a natural volcanic hill that was progressively built upon by humans at more conventional, much later dates, remains a genuinely open question, currently unresolved, and likely to remain unresolved until either more rigorous, independently replicated dating work is conducted, or physical evidence of deliberate human construction, worked tools, cut stone with clear artificial tool marks, in situ and undisturbed, is recovered from the deepest, most controversial layers. This is in many ways the most honest place this entire documentary can sit, at the edge of what we currently know, looking at genuinely tantalizing, genuinely unresolved evidence, refusing to pretend more certainty exists in either direction than actually does.
Chapter 8: The Island That Built Before the Pyramids. While Göbekli Tepe and Gunung Adang argue over the deepest, most contested end of the timeline, there is a group of structures where there is no serious dating controversy at all, and which are, on their own terms, almost as difficult to accept, simply because of what they quietly prove about small, isolated communities. On the islands of Malta and Gozo, in the middle of the Mediterranean, sits a collection of megalithic temples, Gigantia, Hagarkim, Menidra, Tarkshin, and others, that are by uncontested radiocarbon dating among the oldest known freestanding stone structures on the planet, with the earliest phases at Gigantia dating to roughly 3600 BCE, meaning these temples were already ancient, already weathered by centuries, before a single stone of the Great Pyramid of Giza had been quarried.
This deserves to be said plainly, because it rarely is, outside of specialist circles. The oldest freestanding stone buildings on Earth that are not disputed, not contested, not caught up in any retraction controversy, sit not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, but on a small cluster of islands in the middle of the Mediterranean, built by a population that, based on all available evidence, numbered only in the low thousands at most, isolated on islands with limited natural resources, no large stands of timber, no significant metal deposits, and no evidence of a centralized state or monarchy of the kind later civilizations relied on to organize monumental labor.
And it gets stranger. Beneath the town of Paola on Malta lies the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, an underground complex carved directly into limestone bedrock across 3 descending levels, containing chambers, complex bevel-cut ceilings that appear to replicate above-ground temple architecture in solid rock underground, and one particular chamber known as the Oracle Room, where a small carved niche in the wall has been demonstrated through modern acoustic testing to resonate powerfully at low frequencies, specifically around 110 Hz, a frequency that modern neuroscience research has associated with altered states of consciousness and measurable changes in prefrontal cortex activity when experienced in an enclosed space. Whether the builders deliberately engineered this acoustic effect, or discovered and then deliberately preserved and emphasized a naturally resonant chamber, remains debated, but the effect itself is measurable, repeatable, and was very likely known to and possibly used ritually by the people who carved this space by hand, using only stone and antler tools roughly 5,500 years ago.
The hypogeum also contained, when properly excavated in the early 20th century, the remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals, along with red ochre decoration, spiral motifs echoed at temple sites across the islands, and small clay figurines, including the famous Sleeping Lady, a figurine of a reclining, apparently sleeping woman found in the deepest chamber, whose exact meaning remains, like so much of this story, a matter of informed but ultimately unresolved interpretation. Then, around 2500 BCE, after roughly 1,000 years of continuous temple-building tradition, construction on Malta simply stops, abruptly, and for reasons that remain unclear. Some researchers point to evidence of soil exhaustion and deforestation, an island population that may have simply outgrown what its limited land could sustainably support. Others point to possible climate shifts affecting the wider Mediterranean around this period. Whatever the cause, an entire sophisticated temple-building tradition, one that had produced the oldest freestanding stone architecture in the world, appears to end not through invasion or catastrophe, as far as current evidence shows, but through a slower, quieter kind of ending: overuse, environmental exhaustion, and eventual population decline, on an island too small and too isolated to recover the way a mainland culture might have.
It's a smaller, quieter story than a comet impact or a submerged continent, but it deserves inclusion here because it proves something the rest of this documentary needs you to hold on to. Sophisticated, monumental, ritually complex building societies did not require large populations, large empires, or advanced metallurgy. A few thousand people, isolated on a resource-poor island, with only stone tools, sustained an architectural and spiritual tradition for 1,000 years, one that still physically exists for you to visit today. If a population this small, this isolated, could do this much, it becomes considerably easier to accept that larger, better resourced populations living on the rich, now drowned coastlines of the Ice Age world could have been doing something at least as sophisticated in the centuries and millennia before rising seas erased the physical evidence entirely.
At Stonehenge itself, whose main phase of construction is now dated to around 2500 BCE, though earlier phases of the site, ditch and bank earthworks, reach back to around 3000 BCE. The alignment of the monument's main axis with the sunrise on the summer solstice and sunset on the winter solstice is one of the most extensively studied and least disputed astronomical alignments in world archaeology, confirmed through generations of careful surveying and, more recently, precise satellite positioning. What's striking, laid all together, is the pattern itself. Across an enormous span of geography, Anatolia, Egypt, the British Isles, and across a considerable span of time, from Göbekli Tepe's earliest phases through to Stonehenge's completion, a period covering perhaps 7,000 years, ancient builders repeatedly, independently, invested extraordinary labor into aligning permanent stone monuments with specific, predictable celestial events. This wasn't a single culture's idiosyncratic obsession. It was something close to a universal instinct among early monument-building societies, wherever and whenever they arose. Some researchers have proposed that this instinct traces back to something more fundamental than any single culture's religious tradition, to the simple, practical necessity for any settled or semi-settled community, depending on seasonal resources, of tracking the year accurately, knowing when floods would come, when migratory herds would arrive, when to plant, when rains would fall. Skywatching, under this interpretation, wasn't primarily mysticism. It was agriculture and survival, encoded into architecture, because architecture, unlike memory, doesn't forget, doesn't die with the elder who knew the old calendar, and doesn't need to be relearned by every new generation from scratch. A stone aligned correctly to the solstice will keep telling you the same true thing for 10,000 years, long after the people who aligned it are gone.
If that interpretation is right, it reframes everything we've discussed so far in a quietly moving way. These monuments, Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, Stonehenge, and by extension, whatever may lie beneath Gunung Padang or beneath the waves at Yonaguni, were not simply displays of power or abstract religious devotion. They may have been, at their core, information storage systems, attempts by people who had just lived through, or whose ancestors had lived through, a period of catastrophic, world-altering climate instability, to build something permanent enough that the knowledge encoded in it could survive the next disaster, even if the people themselves did not.
Chapter 12. The Anomaly on the Seafloor. In June of 2011, a Swedish salvage and treasure hunting company called Ocean X Team was surveying the floor of the Baltic Sea between Sweden and Finland, searching for shipwrecks, when their sonar equipment picked up something unexpected sitting at a depth of roughly 87 meters. A large, disc-shaped formation, roughly 60 meters across, with what appeared to be a rough, textured surface, sitting atop what sonar imaging suggested might be a stem or pedestal-like structure, alongside a second separate object nearby, with a more elongated runway-like shape. The images released to the public spread rapidly, in part because the shape genuinely does resemble, in low-resolution sonar imaging, something closer to a crashed disk than a natural seabed feature, inevitably drawing immediate, enthusiastic comparisons to a downed spacecraft, in exactly the kind of overheated framing that tends to do real archaeological mysteries more harm than good. Subsequent dives by the Ocean X team and later analysis by professional geologists produced a far less dramatic but still genuinely interesting explanation. Volker Bruchert, a geologist at Stockholm University who analyzed samples brought up from the site, concluded that the material was consistent with ordinary glacial sediment, likely a moraine deposit, formed by material carried and shaped by the movement of Ice Age glaciers as they advanced and retreated across this exact region tens of thousands of years ago, later shaped further by the movement of the seafloor itself. Round or oval mounds and ridges of this kind are a well-documented and reasonably common feature of formerly glaciated seabeds throughout the Baltic and North Sea, and while the Baltic Sea anomaly remains visually striking, and the object's precise internal structure has never been fully excavated or independently verified beyond surface sampling, the mainstream geological consensus treats it as a natural, if unusually shaped, glacial feature rather than an artificial structure of any kind, human or otherwise. We include this not because the evidence points toward anything extraordinary. By most careful accounts, it does not, but because it's instructive as a case study in exactly how these stories tend to spread and exactly how they should be evaluated. A striking sonar image, released without full context or follow-up verification, generates enormous public fascination within days. The far less dramatic, more carefully researched explanation, arriving months or years later after actual geologists have had time to sample and analyze the site properly, receives a fraction of the attention the original claim did. This pattern repeats constantly throughout this entire subject area, and it's worth actively guarding against it as we move through the remainder of tonight's story. Sensational claims travel fast and far. The patient, careful, unglamorous work of actually verifying or debunking them travels slowly and quietly, and often never fully catches up in the public imagination. It's also worth noting, honestly, that this cuts both ways. The same asymmetry that inflates a natural glacial ridge into a supposed alien disk also causes genuinely significant discoveries, like the Taş Tepeler cluster of sites near Göbekli Tepe, still being excavated using cutting-edge ground-penetrating radar as recently as the last few years, to receive far less mainstream attention than they deserve, simply because here is a real, carefully verified, genuinely paradigm-shifting archaeological site is a quieter, slower building story than here is a possible crashed UFO.
The Baltic Sea anomaly and Göbekli Tepe were making headlines in roughly the same period of the early 2010s. Only one of them turned out to be a piece of Ice Age geology. The other turned out to require rewriting the opening chapter of civilization itself. Guess which one most people have actually heard of?
Chapter 13. Two Camps, One Argument. It would be dishonest to spend this many hours walking through this material without addressing, directly and by name, the wider public argument this entire subject has become caught up in over the past 3 decades, because understanding that argument and where its actual fault lines lie will help you evaluate everything you encounter on this topic long after tonight's documentary ends. On one side of this argument sits what's often called alternative archaeology, or less charitably, pseudo-archaeology, a loose movement of researchers, authors, and media figures, the most prominent of whom is British writer and television presenter Graham Hancock, whose books and more recently Netflix series have argued for the existence of a single, advanced, seafaring lost civilization that flourished before the Younger Dryas cataclysm, was largely destroyed by it, and whose scattered survivors subsequently traveled the globe, seeding the foundational knowledge, including monumental architecture and astronomical alignment, behind sites as geographically and chronologically distant as Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids of Giza and of Mesoamerica, and various megalithic sites worldwide. On the other side sits the overwhelming mainstream consensus of professional archaeology, anthropology, and geology, represented by figures like archaeologist Flint Dibble, who has become one of Hancock's most prominent and vocal public critics, who argue that this single lost civilization model is not supported by the actual archaeological evidence, and that the genuine, real, individually remarkable discoveries this documentary has spent hours discussing, Göbekli Tepe, Malta's temples, Nabta Playa, the flood myths, the genetic bottlenecks, do not require and are not best explained by a single unified precursor civilization spreading its knowledge worldwide. Instead, mainstream archaeologists argue these represent separate, independent human populations in different regions at different times, arriving at broadly similar solutions: monumental architecture, celestial alignment, flood mythology, because these are, in a sense, natural, recurring responses that organized human societies tend to converge on once they reach a certain threshold of population size and social complexity, regardless of whether they have any contact with each other at all. Humans in unrelated parts of the world independently invented agriculture, independently invented writing, independently invented monumental stone architecture, and independently developed flood myths, not because a single lost civilization taught them all, but because human minds, facing broadly similar problems, tend to arrive at broadly similar cultural solutions.
What this dispute does illustrate, clearly, is something worth carrying forward into the rest of tonight's story. That even our most famous, most photographed, most thoroughly studied ancient monuments still contain genuine, unresolved mysteries in their physical fabric. Mysteries that trained experts continue to actively argue about, using real scientific method, without a definitive resolution in sight. The story of the ancient world is not a closed book with a few eccentric footnotes. It is, in places, still very much an open, contested, live investigation. Chapter 10. What Our Blood Remembers. So far, this story has been told through stone, through sediment, through myth. But there is a fourth kind of evidence, one that has only become available to researchers in the last 2 decades, and it comes from an unexpected place: the DNA carried in the cells of living people today.
Population genetics, the study of how genetic variation is distributed across human populations and how that distribution changes over time, has become one of the most powerful tools available for understanding what actually happened to human populations during and after the Younger Dryas, because DNA, unlike stone or myth, carries a kind of built-in clock. Mutations accumulate at roughly predictable rates, which allows geneticists to estimate, with increasing precision as sequencing technology has improved, when populations expanded, when they contracted, when they mixed with other populations, and when they became isolated from them. And the genetic record of this exact period, the end of the Ice Age, spanning roughly 15,000 to 11,000 years ago, shows something that lines up unmistakably with everything else we've discussed tonight: evidence of dramatic population bottlenecks, sudden contractions in genetic diversity, consistent with populations that shrank sharply, in some regions catastrophically, before later expanding again.
In the Americas specifically, genetic studies of both ancient and modern indigenous populations have identified signatures consistent with a population bottleneck occurring at approximately the same window associated with the Younger Dryas onset, the same period in which the Clovis culture disappears from the archaeological record and North American megafauna collapse. This doesn't prove a comet impact caused it. Genetics alone cannot distinguish between a population crash caused by cosmic impact, by catastrophic climate whiplash, or by some combination of factors, including disease and resource collapse following either. But it does provide independent confirmation from an entirely separate line of evidence that something happened to human populations in this window severe enough to leave a lasting, measurable genetic scar, still detectable in the DNA of descendant populations today, thousands of generations later. In Europe, ancient DNA research, particularly work coming out of labs specializing in ancient genome sequencing over the past 15 years, has revealed a genuinely startling finding. The population that inhabited much of Western Europe before and immediately after the Younger Dryas appears to have been substantially, in some regions almost entirely, replaced or displaced over the following millennia by successive waves of new populations moving in from the east and from Anatolia, the same region notably where Göbekli Tepe was built. Modern Western Europeans carry only a modest fraction of direct genetic descent from the hunter-gatherer populations who were present in the region during and immediately after the Younger Dryas cold snap. The majority of modern European ancestry traces to later population movements, particularly the spread of early farming populations out of Anatolia beginning around 9,000 years ago, and a subsequent, still later migration of pastoralist populations from the Eurasian steppe.
What this means, stated plainly, is something quietly remarkable. The people who were there, who lived through the Younger Dryas cold snap in Ice Age Europe, whoever they were, whatever they had built or were capable of building, are, for the most part, genetically gone. Not entirely. Small genetic traces persist in modern populations, and certain relict hunter-gatherer lineages revived in pockets, particularly in parts of Scandinavia and the Baltic. But the population that experienced this catastrophe most directly did not go on, in large numbers, to become the ancestors of the people who occupy that same land today. They were succeeded, replaced, and in some interpretations of the data, effectively erased as a demographic presence within a few thousand years of the event. This has a genuinely unsettling implication for the entire question this documentary has been circling. If an advanced culture, even a modestly advanced one, nowhere near requiring pyramids or writing, simply organized enough to build something like an early, rougher version of what we later see at Göbekli Tepe, existed among the populations occupying Ice Age Europe's drowned coastlines before or during the Younger Dryas, and that population was subsequently and substantially replaced by later migrations, the genetic record would look almost exactly like what we actually observe: a discontinuity, a population present, then gone, succeeded by newcomers who did not necessarily inherit or continue whatever cultural or technological traditions their predecessors had developed.
This is speculative. Genetics cannot tell us what a vanished population built, only that it was there and then, demographically, mostly wasn't. But it closes an important gap in the story. It gives us a genuine, evidence-based mechanism by which knowledge, tradition, and cultural continuity could have been broken, even if the people themselves were not entirely extinguished. Even if scattered survivor groups persisted, relocated, and generations later found themselves rebuilding something like what had come before, in a new place, among new neighbors, carrying only fragments, a flood story, a ritual gesture, a symbol carved on a pillar of what their ancestors had actually known. Chapter 11. The Sky They Built into Stone. One of the most persistent and most quietly convincing threads running through nearly every site this documentary has discussed is astronomy. The observation that a striking number of these ancient monuments appear to be deliberately aligned with specific celestial events in ways too precise and too repeated across unrelated cultures to easily dismiss as coincidence.
At Göbekli Tepe, researchers including Giulio Mali of the Polytechnic University of Milan have proposed that several of the site's enclosures show orientations consistent with tracking the heliacal rising of specific bright stars, meaning the first appearance of a star above the horizon just before dawn, after a period where it had been below the horizon and invisible, a phenomenon many ancient cultures used as a practical, highly accurate calendar marker, since it recurs with precise regularity. Whether this specific alignment interpretation holds up to further scrutiny remains debated among specialists. As with most archaeoastronomy claims, correlation between a structure's orientation and a celestial event can sometimes be found through pattern matching after the fact, without the builders necessarily having intended it, and serious researchers in this field are increasingly careful about this exact trap. But it is notable that similar celestial alignment arguments have been made independently by different research teams at an unusually wide range of sites from this general era and the millennia immediately following it.
At Nabda Playa, in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, archaeologists have identified a stone circle, smaller and less visually dramatic than Stonehenge, but substantially older, dated to roughly 6,000 to 6,400 years ago, built by a population of cattle-herding nomads living around a seasonal lake in what is now hyper-arid desert. Astronomer J. McKim Malville and colleagues have argued that specific stones within the circle align with the position of certain bright stars, including Sirius and stars within the constellation Orion, at the summer solstice, as it would have appeared during the site's construction period, potentially marking the seasonal arrival of monsoon rains that the community's survival in this marginal desert environment would have depended on tracking precisely.
Research teams at an unusually wide range of sites from this general era and the millennia immediately following it.
What was lost, then, in the catastrophe at the center of this story may not have been a single unified civilization's unique inventions waiting to be rediscovered intact somewhere on the ocean floor. What may have been lost is far more diffuse and, in its own way, more moving. Countless separate communities, each holding their own accumulated version of this same universal human instinct, to watch the sky, to mark its rhythms in stone, to bury the dead with ritual, to tell a flood story to their children. Communities that mostly vanished not because a comet or a flood erased their existence outright everywhere at once, but because rising water, shifting resources, and the slow churn of population replacement over subsequent millennia simply didn't allow most of their specific local versions of this knowledge to survive intact into the historical record we've been able to excavate.
We didn't lose one Atlantis. We may have lost hundreds of smaller, quieter ones. Coastal communities, drowned river deltas, entire regional traditions, each of which we will, in all likelihood, never fully recover, because the physical evidence for most of them is sitting under tens of meters of ocean, in exactly the places modern archaeology has only just begun to learn how to properly search.
Chapter 16. The Search That's Happening Right Now. It would be easy, sitting with everything we've covered tonight, to feel like this is a closed story, a set of mysteries that will always remain mysteries, permanently out of reach, sitting under too much ocean for anyone to ever properly resolve. That feeling is understandable, but it isn't accurate. The truth is that the tools available to search for exactly this kind of evidence have improved more in the last 15 years than in the previous century combined, and active, funded, serious research is happening right now in multiple countries, specifically targeting the questions this documentary has spent hours raising.
LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a technology that uses laser pulses fired from aircraft or drones to map ground surfaces with extraordinary precision, capable of digitally stripping away dense forest canopy to reveal the shape of the land and any structures on it underneath, has over the past decade completely transformed archaeology in densely forested regions that were previously almost impossible to survey on any large scale. In the jungles of Central America, LiDAR surveys have revealed tens of thousands of previously unknown structures beneath the Maya lowlands, essentially overnight, compared to the pace of traditional ground survey. Entire causeway networks, defensive earthworks, and residential complexes connecting sites that archaeologists had for decades assumed were relatively isolated, revealing instead a landscape of far denser, far more interconnected settlement than anyone had previously mapped. Similar LiDAR surveys are now being applied with increasing frequency to forested regions of Southeast Asia, including areas near Gunung Padang and across the wider Indonesian archipelago, specifically searching for exactly the kind of buried or overgrown monumental structures this documentary has discussed.
Underwater, the tools have advanced just as dramatically. Multi-beam sonar, capable of generating detailed three-dimensional maps of the seafloor from a moving vessel, has become dramatically cheaper and more accessible over the past 2 decades, and is now being used systematically, rather than opportunistically, to survey continental shelf regions that were underwater grazing land, delta plains, and coastline during the Ice Age. Researchers associated with projects like Europe's Lost Frontiers initiative, led by archaeologists including Vincent Gaffney, have combined seismic survey data originally collected by oil and gas exploration companies, repurposed for archaeological rather than commercial use, with sediment coring to build detailed meter-by-meter reconstructions of what Doggerland actually looked like before it drowned, its rivers, its lake systems, its likely settlement locations, allowing researchers to target specific promising coordinates for future underwater excavation, rather than searching blindly across an area the size of a small country.
In the Baltic and North Seas, fishing trawlers and offshore wind farm construction crews have, over the past 2 decades, incidentally recovered a genuinely remarkable quantity of worked flint tools and even occasional preserved organic material from the seabed, evidence which is increasingly being systematically cataloged rather than treated as scattered curiosities, building, piece by piece, an actual physical picture of Doggerland's lost human population, rather than relying purely on theoretical reconstruction. There is also a sharper, more pointed critique that mainstream archaeologists raise, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than softened. The lost advanced civilization narrative, as popularized in mainstream media, has often carried an uncomfortable and largely unexamined implication: the suggestion that indigenous populations in places like Egypt, Mesoamerica, and Indonesia
could not have developed their own monumental architecture and astronomical knowledge independently, and must instead have received it from an external, more advanced, and, in the way it's typically visually depicted, notably lighter-skinned, lost source culture. This pattern of assumption has deep, uncomfortable roots in colonial-era archaeology, when European excavators genuinely did refuse, for openly stated racist reasons, to believe that African, Mesoamerican, or South Asian societies were capable of building the monuments found on their own land without help from some imagined external master civilization. Modern proponents of lost civilization theories are not, for the most part, consciously advancing that older colonial framing, and it would be unfair to flatten every alternative researcher into holding those views. But the historical shadow is real, well documented, and part of why professional archaeologists react to these theories with more visible frustration than the theory's specific factual claims might on their own seem to warrant.
Where does that leave us at the end of this particular chapter, trying to be genuinely fair to both sides? It leaves us here. The individual, specific discoveries this documentary has spent hours walking through, the improbable age of Göbekli Tepe, the abrupt violence of the Younger Dryas, the widespread persistence of flood mythology, the disputed but genuinely unresolved questions at Yonaguni, at Gunung Padang, in the Sphinx enclosure's weathering pattern, are not fringe claims invented by pseudo-archaeologists. They are, without exception, published, real, actively studied findings and disputes within mainstream, credentialed science. What is genuinely more speculative, and where the serious scientific consensus does part ways clearly from the popularized lost civilization narrative, is the specific claim that all of these separate mysteries trace back to one single, unified, advanced global civilization that existed before the Younger Dryas and was destroyed by it.
The more careful, more evidence-supported version of this story, the version this documentary has tried to tell you tonight, doesn't require a single lost Atlantis. It requires something arguably more interesting, a genuinely catastrophic, well-documented climate collapse, hitting a species that we now know, thanks to discoveries made only in the last 30 years, was already considerably more organized, more symbolically sophisticated, and more capable of monumental cooperative labor than anyone assumed as recently as the 1990s. A species that likely lost an enormous amount in terms of population, coastal territory, and accumulated cultural knowledge during that collapse, and that we are still, quite literally, only beginning to excavate the physical remains of, both on land and, far more slowly and expensively, underwater. You do not need one drowned Atlantis to find this story extraordinary. You need only accept what the mainstream evidence itself, honestly and carefully read, already tells us, that something significant, still not fully understood, and still being actively discovered, happened to human civilization roughly 12,000 years ago, and that we are, right now, in your own lifetime, in the middle of a genuine, ongoing scientific reckoning with just how much earlier organized human civilization may actually reach back than we assumed only a few decades ago. Chapter 14. A Single Day, Reconstructed. Before we move toward the close of this story, let's do something a little different, something clearly imaginative, clearly a reconstruction rather than a factual record, but built entirely out of the real evidence we've spent the last several hours walking through. Let's try to picture, carefully and specifically, a single day, somewhere on a drowned Ice Age coastline, sometime in the centuries just before the Younger Dryas cold snap began. We don't know precisely where this coastline is. It could be the shelf beneath what's now the Persian Gulf, or the plain now called Doggerland beneath the North Sea, or the shallow drowned margins of Sunderland in Southeast Asia. We're not claiming this specific scene is documented fact. We're using it as a way of holding, in your mind, all at once, everything the evidence actually does support, because a list of isolated facts is hard to feel, and a scene, even an imagined one, built honestly from real evidence, is easier to sit with as you drift toward sleep.
Picture, then, a wide river delta, somewhere on a coastline that no longer exists. The air is warmer than you might expect from an ice age. This is a temperate, resource-rich lowland, not a frozen wasteland. It is the retreating ice sheets far to the north that define this as an ice age, not the conditions here at the water's edge. Reed beds line slow channels. Waterfowl move in enormous seasonal numbers, migrating along a coastline route that has been stable generation after generation for longer than anyone alive can remember. A community lives here, not a city in the sense we'd recognize, not stone towers or paved streets, but a settled, semi-permanent cluster of shelters built from reed, timber, and hide, positioned to take advantage of fish runs, waterfowl migrations, and shellfish beds that this stretch of coast reliably provides, generation after generation, in a way that a purely mobile, following the herds lifestyle would not require. People here do not need to move constantly, because the resource base beneath their feet and in the water beside them renews itself reliably enough to stay largely in one place much of the year.
Because they stay, they accumulate. Not wealth in the sense we'd use the word today, but knowledge, accumulated, passed down, refined generation after generation, about the specific rhythms of this specific place, when the fish run, when the birds arrive, which star rises first in the pre-dawn sky at the start of flood season, which plants can be gathered and dried to last through leaner months. Some of that knowledge, over generations, gets encoded, not yet in writing, because writing as we understand it is still thousands of years away, but in ritual, in carved and painted symbols, in the position of certain stones set up to mark where the sun rises on the day the floods begin, in songs and stories told at gatherings that draw people from other settlements up and down the coast, exchanging goods, exchanging marriage partners, exchanging exactly the kind of shared symbolic tradition that we see, fully formed and already old, by the time Göbekli Tepe's builders start raising their first pillars 1,000 years or more later, in the hill country, far from any coast at all, carried inland perhaps by people who had already lost their own coastline once and were determined never to lose the knowledge itself again.
And then, over a handful of generations, a span of time that would feel to someone living through only one part of it, like ordinary gradual change, a few meters of shoreline lost per lifetime, a story their grandparents told about where the good fishing used to be before it was underwater. The water keeps coming, not always gently. Sometimes during the specific violent pulses geologists have identified in the sediment record, the sea rises catastrophically fast, faster than any single human lifetime should reasonably have to witness, drowning in a few years land that had supported that community's entire way of life for centuries.
Some communities in this reconstruction are lost outright, caught by a storm surge, a tsunami following an underwater landslide as suddenly destabilized coastal slopes give way, or simply overwhelmed gradually beyond the point of viability, forced to abandon fishing grounds and gathering sites their entire identity had been built around. Others retreat, inland, carrying what they can, not stone buildings, which cannot be carried, but the intangible things, the songs, the star knowledge, the ritual gestures, the flood story that will, eventually, over centuries of retelling and travel and intermarriage with communities they encounter along the way, become the seed of the story a very different people will eventually write down on clay tablets in Mesopotamia and call the story of Utnapishtim, and that a different people still will call the story of Noah, and that a different people still, on the far side of the world, will call the story of Manu and the great fish.
This is not a documented, proven sequence of events. We want to be completely clear about that one more time before we move on. It is a plausible narrative scaffold, built honestly out of the sea level data, the flood mythology, the Göbekli Tepe dating, and the genetic population replacement evidence this documentary has walked through across the last several hours. Offered to you not as fact, but as a way of feeling, rather than merely knowing, what it might have meant to be a person living through the actual, real, geologically documented catastrophe at the center of tonight's story. Chapter 15. What survived and what didn't. Let's step back from imagination and return to evidence for one of the last major threads in this story, because there is a genuine, documented pattern running across multiple unrelated ancient cultures of specific symbols and motifs that recur with striking consistency. And it's worth asking, honestly, what that consistency might mean.
The vulture is one of the clearest examples. At Göbekli Tepe, vultures appear repeatedly, carved in relief on multiple pillars, in some cases depicted alongside what appear to be headless human figures, an image many archaeologists interpret as connected to excarnation, a funerary practice in which the bodies of the dead are deliberately exposed to scavenging birds rather than buried, allowing the vulture to serve as a kind of psychopomp, a creature that carries the spirit or essence of the dead from the world of the living into whatever lies beyond. This same symbolic association between vultures and the passage of the dead reappears, thousands of years later and thousands of kilometers away, in ancient Egyptian religion, where the vulture goddess Nekhbet is one of the most important protective and funerary deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon, and in Zoroastrian traditions in Persia, where excarnation via towers of silence, specifically exposing the dead to vultures, remained an actual practiced funerary rite for thousands of years, in some communities into the present day.
The serpent is another recurring threat, appearing at Göbekli Tepe, in Mesoamerican traditions as Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, in ancient Egyptian religion as both a protective symbol, the uraeus worn on royal crowns, and as a chaotic threat, the serpent Apophis, in Hindu tradition as the Naga, in the biblical tradition as the serpent in Eden. Serpent symbolism is, admittedly, one of the easiest cross-cultural motifs to overinterpret, since snakes are dangerous, widespread animals that virtually every human culture on every continent has had direct, memorable encounters with, giving every culture on Earth an independent, obvious reason to develop serpent symbolism without needing any shared origin at all. Responsible researchers are generally cautious about reading too much into serpent imagery specifically, for exactly this reason.
More genuinely striking, and harder to dismiss as pure coincidence, is the recurring architectural instinct towards specific numbers and specific alignments. The repeated appearance of circular or oval enclosures oriented towards solstice or stellar events, discussed in the previous chapter, appearing at Göbekli Tepe, at Nabta Playa, at Stonehenge, and, in modified form, in the circular kiva structures of the American Southwest, and in stone circles found across the British Isles, Brittany, and Scandinavia. And there is the persistent cross-cultural association of specific numbers with cosmological or calendrical significance, groupings of pillars or stones in patterns of 12, of 7, of multiples of these, appearing in contexts too distant from each other for direct cultural transmission to be a remotely plausible explanation, and yet recurring often enough that many researchers believe these numbers reflect not shared contact, but shared, independently discovered astronomical realities. 12 lunar cycles marking a rough year, 7 visible moving lights in the ancient sky, the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, meaning the sky itself, being the same sky for every human culture on Earth, may be doing the work of spreading these numerical patterns worldwide, without requiring any lost civilization to carry them from place to place at all.
This is, in some ways, the most quietly satisfying resolution available to us tonight. Sitting as it does directly between the two extremes, this documentary has tried to avoid collapsing into. You do not need a single advanced lost civilization, spreading identical architectural knowledge across the globe by ship, to explain why humans in wildly separated regions kept building circular, sky-aligned monuments using recurring sacred numbers. You need only accept that every one of these separate human populations was looking up at the same moon, the same visible planets, the same annually recurring solstices, and that the human mind, wherever it develops settled cooperative society complex enough to build in stone, appears to reliably, independently, arrive at broadly similar ways of encoding that shared sky into permanent architecture.
There's also a more basic problem with the Hapgood interpretation that deserves mention. Even under his own theory, the accurate match to subglacial Antarctic topography relies on comparing the map to seismic survey data of the Antarctic coastline that wasn't collected until the mid-20th century, meaning the specific claimed correspondence between the map and the real ice-free coastline has always depended on a fairly generous subjective reading of a hand-drawn, non-scientifically surveyed 16th century sketch laid loosely over modern scientific data, a comparison method that professional cartographic historians regard as methodologically weak, prone to the same kind of after-the-fact pattern matching we flagged as a risk in the archaeoastronomy chapter earlier tonight.
We include this not to mock the underlying curiosity behind it. The instinct to look at an old map and wonder what the person who drew it actually knew and how they knew it is a good and healthy instinct, the same instinct driving essentially everything else in this documentary. But the Piri Reis map, examined carefully, does not hold up as strong evidence for a lost advanced civilization with knowledge of ice-free Antarctica. It holds up instead as a genuinely interesting 16th century Ottoman cartographic achievement, compiled from a patchwork of real, contemporary exploration data and imaginative extension, exactly the way most maps from this era were made. If anything, this case is a useful reminder of the standard we've tried to apply consistently across this entire documentary. Genuine, still unresolved mysteries, Göbekli Tepe's early date, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the Sphinx weathering question, Gunung Padang's deepest layers, deserve to be taken seriously precisely because, after decades of scrutiny, they remain seriously unresolved among credentialed experts. Claims that have been thoroughly examined and have a well-supported mundane explanation, like the Baltic Sea anomaly and like the Piri Reis map's supposed Antarctic coastline, deserve to be set down, clearly and without embarrassment, once that examination has actually been done. Being appropriately skeptical cuts in both directions, and a documentary that only ever pushes toward the more exciting conclusion isn't actually being honest with you, even when the exciting conclusion happens to be the one you were hoping to hear.
Chapter 19. The Great Dying. We touched on this briefly when we first discussed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, but it deserves its own proper space, told slowly, because the sheer scale of what happened to large animal life at the end of the Ice Age is, on its own, one of the most dramatic and consequential events in the entire history of life on this planet, and it happened during precisely the window this documentary has been circling all night.
For roughly 2.5 million years, throughout the entire span of the Pleistocene epoch, the world was home to an extraordinary array of megafauna, genuinely enormous animals, far larger than anything most continents host today. North America alone was home to mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths that stood taller than a grown man on their hind legs, glyptodons, armored mammals roughly the size and shape of a small car, essentially giant armadillo relatives, American lions, larger than any lion alive today,
saber-toothed cats, giant short-faced bears that may have been the largest land predator ever to walk the continent, and herds of horses and camels, both of which, remarkably, actually originated in North America before later populations migrated elsewhere and the North American populations themselves went extinct.
Similar megafauna existed on every inhabited continent. Australia had diprotodons, wombat relatives the size of a small rhinoceros, and giant flightless birds. South America had enormous ground sloths and a bizarre array of native ungulates found nowhere else on Earth. Northern Eurasia had woolly rhinoceros alongside its mammoths. This was, across the entire globe, an age of genuinely giant land animals, on a scale the modern world, outside of a handful of remaining African and Asian megafauna, simply does not have any living equivalent for.
And then, within a geological instant, a period depending on the specific continent and species, ranging from a few hundred to at most a couple of thousand years, heavily concentrated around the Younger Dryas boundary in North America specifically, the overwhelming majority of this megafauna vanished. In North America alone, roughly 3/4 of all large mammal genera that had survived the entire preceding ice age went extinct within this narrow window. This wasn't a gradual background rate of extinction. It was a sudden, catastrophic, continent-wide collapse of the largest animals on the landscape, occurring at almost exactly the same geological moment the climate itself violently reversed, and an entire established human tool-making culture disappeared from the archaeological record.
In the Persian Gulf, satellite imagery analysis combined with core sampling has allowed researchers, including Jeffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham, to reconstruct the likely shape and fresh water resources of the drowned river valley beneath the Gulf with considerable confidence, and to identify specific, now submerged regions that would have offered the most viable long-term refuge for human populations during the harshest millennia of the last glacial maximum, sites that remain, as of tonight, largely unexcavated, awaiting the kind of dedicated underwater archaeological survey that is expensive, logistically difficult, and only just beginning to receive serious institutional funding and attention.
None of this guarantees that a dramatic, singular, lost civilization will be found intact tomorrow, or next year, or in our lifetimes. Realistically, most underwater archaeology of this kind proceeds slowly, expensively, and in small incremental steps, punctuated by long stretches where nothing especially dramatic is found at all. But the trajectory of the actual evidence over just the last 3 decades has moved firmly and repeatedly in one direction, toward pushing the timeline of organized, monumental, cooperative human society further back than the previous generation of archaeologists believed possible, and toward taking seriously, with real funding and real technology, exactly the drowned coastal regions this documentary has spent hours arguing were probably the richest, most densely populated parts of the Ice Age world.
Klaus Schmidt, before his death, was fond of saying that Göbekli Tepe proved archaeology still had room for genuine surprises, that the story of human civilization was not a settled, fully written book, but one where entire new chapters could still, quite literally, be dug up out of a hillside a farmer had been plowing around for generations without knowing what sat beneath his field. Given everything this documentary has walked through tonight, from a diver stumbling onto an underwater staircase while looking for sharks, to a retracted paper about a hill in Java, to genetic evidence of a population that quietly vanished from Ice Age Europe, to flood stories told by people on opposite sides of the planet who never once met each other, it's difficult to disagree with him.
The story of what happened 12,000 years ago is not finished. It is, in the most literal sense possible, still being written, by geologists pulling ice cores in Greenland, by archaeologists running ground-penetrating radar over Turkish hillsides, by fishing trawlers occasionally hauling up a worked flint blade from 50 meters of North Sea water, and by researchers, right now, tonight, somewhere in the world, quietly reviewing sonar data from a coastline that hasn't been above water in over 10,000 years, looking for a shape that shouldn't be there.
Chapter 17. The Man Who Started All of This. Before we go any further, we should pause and do something most documentaries on this subject skip entirely, and it's an important gap to fill, because almost every idea we've discussed tonight eventually gets compared by someone in a comment section or a late-night conversation to one specific word: Atlantis. It's worth knowing exactly where that word actually came from, and how far the popular idea of it has drifted from the original source. Atlantis was not originally a piece of ancient folk tradition passed down through generations, the way the flood myths we discussed earlier were. It comes from a single identifiable source, the Greek philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, in 2 of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the unfinished Critias. In these texts, Plato has a character named Critias describe a story supposedly passed down from the Athenian statesman Solon, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests roughly 2 centuries earlier, a chain of second-hand retelling that should, on its own, make any careful reader cautious. The story describes a powerful island civilization, Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we would now call the Strait of Gibraltar, a technologically and militarily advanced maritime empire that, after growing corrupt and attempting to conquer the known world, was defeated by an idealized ancient Athens and subsequently destroyed by the gods in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and flooding, sinking beneath the sea entirely.
Here is what's important to understand, and it rarely gets stated clearly in popular treatments of this subject. Essentially, no scholar of ancient Greek philosophy believes Plato intended this story as a literal historical account. The overwhelming academic consensus is that Atlantis functions within Plato's broader philosophical project as a moral allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris, about the corrupting influence of power and wealth, and about the superiority of Plato's idealized vision of a disciplined, philosophically governed society, represented by his fictionalized ancient Athens, over a militaristic, materially indulgent empire, represented by Atlantis. Plato was, throughout his work, extremely comfortable inventing detailed, plausible-sounding fictional scenarios to illustrate philosophical points. The allegory of the cave, similarly vivid and specific, is universally understood as illustrative fiction, not a claimed historical event, and most classicists treat Atlantis exactly the same way. And yet, almost immediately, some ancient readers took it literally, and that literal reading has never entirely gone away since. In the late 19th century, an American writer and politician named Ignatius Donnelly published a hugely popular book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882, which took Plato's brief philosophical allegory and expanded it into an enormous, elaborate pseudo-historical framework, claiming Atlantis was a real, advanced civilization that had seeded the origins of virtually all subsequent world civilizations, from Egypt to Mesoamerica. Donnelly's book was not built on new archaeological evidence. None existed to support it then or now, but it was written persuasively, at a moment when the reading public was hungry for grand, unifying historical narratives, and it became a genuine bestseller,
going through numerous editions and directly shaping essentially all subsequent popular lost civilization literature for the following century, including, quite directly, the modern work of Graham Hancock and others we discussed a few chapters ago. Why does this history matter to tonight's story specifically? Because it helps draw a clean, honest line between two very different things that popular culture tends to blur together constantly. The genuine, credentialed, actively debated scientific evidence we've spent most of this documentary walking through, Göbekli Tepe's real radiocarbon dates, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis's real, published, peer-reviewed, if contested evidence, the real and unresolved geological argument over the Sphinx enclosure's weathering, and, entirely separately, a much older, admittedly captivating, but originally and explicitly fictional philosophical device from a single ancient Greek text, later inflated by a 19th century American writer with no archaeological training into the sprawling lost civilization framework that continues to shape and arguably distort how this entire subject gets discussed in popular media today. None of the real evidence discussed tonight requires Atlantis to be true in order to be genuinely remarkable. Göbekli Tepe does not need Plato's sunken island to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the last century. It already is one, entirely on its own factual merits. The flood myths do not need a single sunken Atlantean source to be worth taking seriously as possible echoes of real post-glacial sea level rise. They are worth taking seriously either way. Separating the real, still unfolding scientific mystery from the specific 19th century literary framework that has attached itself to it, like a barnacle on a much older, much more interesting hull, is one of the more useful things this documentary can offer you before we continue.
Chapter 18: The Map That Shouldn't Exist. There is one more specific artifact-based claim that belongs in this conversation because it's one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for a lost advanced civilization in popular media, and it deserves the same careful, both sides treatment we've given everything else tonight: the Piri Reis map. In 1929, during renovation work at the old imperial palace in Istanbul, researchers discovered a fragment of a world map drawn on gazelle skin parchment, dated by an inscription to 1513, and signed by Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer known to have compiled it from a combination of earlier source maps, some of which he explicitly credits, including charts reportedly derived, at least in part, from information gathered by earlier explorers, possibly including material connected to Christopher Columbus's own voyages, made only 2 decades earlier.
The map is a genuinely remarkable historical artifact in its own right, an early, reasonably accurate depiction of the coastline of West Africa and the eastern coast of South America, drawn at a moment when European knowledge of the Americas was still extremely fragmentary. The controversy centers on the map's southern portion, where a landmass is depicted that some researchers, beginning prominently with an American college professor named Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, argued represents an accurate depiction of the coastline of Antarctica, specifically the coastline of Antarctica as it would appear beneath its ice sheet, without ice cover, a configuration that, if the claim were accurate, would require source information gathered before Antarctica's ice sheet formed, or at minimum before it reached its current extent, which geological evidence suggests happened many thousands of years before any known seafaring civilization existed, let alone one capable of mapping it. Hapgood's interpretation gained real, lasting popular traction and remains one of the most repeated claims in this entire genre. It is also rejected almost universally by professional cartographic historians and geographers for reasons worth understanding rather than simply citing.
The most direct rebuttal is that the landmass in question does not require Antarctica as an explanation at all. Careful cartographic analysis suggests the southern portion of the Peary race map is more consistent with a somewhat distorted, imaginatively extended depiction of the South American coastline, continuing further south than it actually does, a common and well-documented practice among cartographers of this exact era, who frequently extended known coastlines with speculative, sometimes wildly inaccurate guesswork to fill blank map space, based on then popular theories requiring a large hypothetical southern continent, Terra Australis, to balance the land masses of the north, a belief with no factual basis. In other words, the impossible Antarctic coastline may simply be a guess, a plausible-looking projection extending from real, known coastline into unknown, then filled with imagined shape, exactly the kind of educated guesswork every mapmaker of this period regularly practiced, and exactly the kind of coastline hallucination, to use a distinctly modern term, that shows up constantly on maps from this era depicting regions Europeans had not yet actually explored.
What caused it remains, like so much else tonight, a genuinely active scientific debate rather than a settled question, and it's worth walking through the real competing explanations rather than picking one and presenting it as certain. The most widely supported mainstream explanation is what's often called the overkill hypothesis, first proposed in detail by geoscientist Paul Martin in the 1960s and refined considerably since. That human hunters, having only recently arrived in previously unpopulated regions like the Americas and Australia, encountered megafauna populations that had no evolved instinct to fear or avoid human predators, making them catastrophically vulnerable to hunting pressure that smaller, more established human-adapted animal populations elsewhere in the world had had tens of thousands of years to develop defensive behavior against. Combined with a rapidly changing climate simultaneously stressing habitat and food availability, this 1-2 punch of new predation pressure plus environmental stress could plausibly account for the extinctions without requiring any external catastrophic trigger at all.
The competing climate-driven explanation argues that the specific, extreme volatility of the terminal Pleistocene climate, including but not limited to the Younger Dryas, was itself sufficient to collapse megafauna populations, particularly species with slow reproductive rates, long gestation periods, and specialized dietary needs that couldn't adapt quickly enough to rapidly shifting vegetation zones, regardless of human hunting pressure. And then there is the impact hypothesis we discussed earlier, which proposes that whatever caused the abrupt Younger Dryas cooling, comet impact, meltwater pulse, or both together, delivered a sufficiently severe, sufficiently sudden shock to the North American ecosystem specifically, that it triggered a cascading collapse across an already climate-stressed megafauna population, compounding rather than replacing the other two explanations.
And then, within a geological instant, a period depending on the specific continent and species, ranging from a few hundred to at most a couple of thousand years, heavily concentrated around the Younger Dryas boundary in North America specifically, the overwhelming majority of this megafauna vanished. In North America alone, roughly 3/4 of all large mammal genera that had survived the entire preceding ice age went extinct within this narrow window. This wasn't a gradual background rate of extinction. It was a sudden, catastrophic, continent-wide collapse of the largest animals on the landscape, occurring at almost exactly the same geological moment the climate itself violently reversed, and an entire established human tool-making culture disappeared from the archaeological record. This changes the shape of the story in an important way. Göbekli Tepe, on its own, could plausibly be described, and for years largely was described, as a singular, remarkable outlier, an unusual, isolated achievement by one unusually motivated community, without necessarily implying anything about the wider sophistication of the surrounding region.
A cluster of over a dozen related sites, built and used across multiple centuries, sharing common architectural vocabulary, common symbolic themes, and clear evidence of shared cultural contact and exchange across the wider region, is a considerably harder thing to wave away as an isolated fluke. It looks, increasingly, like archaeologists have identified an entire regional culture, not yet a civilization in the sense of cities, writing, and centralized government, but a genuinely interconnected network of communities, sharing religious practice, artistic tradition, and monumental building technique that was already active and already sophisticated at a period immediately following the Younger Dryas, when, under the old model, this region should have been home to nothing more than scattered, unconnected bands of foragers.
Excavation across this cluster is very much ongoing as of the recording of this documentary, and researchers working there have said publicly, on multiple occasions, that they expect the picture to keep changing significantly as more of the roughly dozen known sites are more fully excavated over the coming years and decades, meaning that whatever version of this story you're hearing tonight is, almost certainly, already slightly out of date by the time enough time has passed for you to go looking for updates yourself. That's not a flaw in tonight's documentary. It's simply the honest state of a genuinely live, actively unfolding archaeological investigation, and it's worth remembering the next time a headline claims some part of this story has been solved once and for all. Chapter 22: Eden in the East. Let's return to Southeast Asia one more time, because there's a specific, carefully argued academic hypothesis about the drowned continent of Sundaland that deserves more attention than the brief mention we gave it in our earlier chapter on the world before the flood. In 1998, British geneticist and physician Stephen Oppenheimer published a book called Eden in the East, the Drowned Continent of Southeast Asia, building a detailed argument drawn from geology, genetics, linguistics, and comparative mythology that Sundaland, the vast, now largely submerged continental shelf connecting Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula during the Ice Age, may have been home to an early, sophisticated population whose culture, technology, and mythology were subsequently carried outward by successive waves of migration into mainland Asia, the Pacific, and, in Oppenheimer's more speculative later chapters, potentially as far as the Near East, as rising seas progressively fragmented and eventually submerged large portions of their original homeland.
What caused it remains, like so much else tonight, a genuinely active scientific debate rather than a settled question, and it's worth walking through the real competing explanations rather than picking one and presenting it as certain. The most widely supported mainstream explanation is what's often called the overkill hypothesis, first proposed in detail by geoscientist Paul Martin in the 1960s and refined considerably since. That human hunters, having only recently arrived in previously unpopulated regions like the Americas and Australia, encountered megafauna populations that had no evolved instinct to fear or avoid human predators, making them catastrophically vulnerable to hunting pressure that smaller, more established human-adapted animal populations elsewhere in the world had had tens of thousands of years to develop defensive behavior against. Combined with a rapidly changing climate simultaneously stressing habitat and food availability, this 1-2 punch of new predation pressure plus environmental stress could plausibly account for the extinctions without requiring any external catastrophic trigger at all.
The competing climate-driven explanation argues that the specific extreme volatility of the terminal Pleistocene climate, including but not limited to the Younger Dryas, was itself sufficient to collapse megafauna populations, particularly species with slow reproductive rates, long gestation periods, and specialized dietary needs that couldn't adapt quickly enough to rapidly shifting vegetation zones, regardless of human hunting pressure. And then there is the impact hypothesis we discussed earlier, which proposes that whatever caused the abrupt Younger Dryas cooling, comet impact, meltwater pulse, or both together, delivered a sufficiently severe, sufficiently sudden shock to the North American ecosystem specifically that it triggered a cascading collapse across an already climate-stressed megafauna population, compounding rather than replacing the other two explanations.
Most researchers actively working on this question today favor some combination of these factors working together rather than any single cause acting alone. Human hunting pressure arriving at almost precisely the same geological moment as extreme climate volatility, on populations of animals that were, in some cases, already under stress from earlier climate shifts within the preceding millennia. The precise weighting between these factors remains genuinely disputed, varies considerably by species and by continent, and is actively studied using increasingly sophisticated techniques, including ancient DNA extracted directly from megafauna remains, which can reveal population size and genetic diversity trends in the millennia leading up to extinction, helping researchers determine whether a given species was already declining well before humans or the Younger Dryas arrived, or whether it was, by contrast, thriving right up until the moment of sudden collapse.
Why does this matter to the central question of tonight's documentary, the possibility of vanished human sophistication rather than vanished animal life? Because whatever combination of causes drove the megafauna extinction, it happened to the exact same environment, in the exact same window that human populations were living in and depending on. Mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths were not simply background wildlife to Ice Age humans. They were, in many regions, the central resource around which entire human technological and social systems were organized. Primary food sources, providers of hide, bone, and ivory, used for tools, shelter construction, and the kind of elaborate ritual beadwork we discussed earlier at Sungir. The Clovis culture across North America, whose distinctive, beautifully crafted fluted stone spiel points appear consistently across the continent right up until the Younger Dryas boundary, and then abruptly disappear from the archaeological record at almost exactly that same moment, appears to have been substantially organized, at least in significant part, around the hunting of exactly this megafauna.
When the megafauna collapsed, whatever specific mixture of causes drove that collapse, the entire resource base and established human culture had built its way of life around collapsed with it, in the same narrow window of time, on the same continent, at the same moment the climate itself was reversing catastrophically. It would be genuinely surprising if a human population facing the simultaneous loss of its primary food resources, its established hunting technology's primary targets, and a decade-scale collapse in regional temperature did not experience severe, rapid, disruptive change to its population size, its settlement patterns, and its cultural continuity. Exactly the kind of severe disruption that, as we discussed in the genetics chapter, does show up clearly in the population bottleneck signatures preserved in DNA today.
Chapter 20. The Mounds That Came Too Early. There's one more site that belongs in this conversation, and like Göbekli Tepe, its significance comes almost entirely from a single stubborn fact, a radiocarbon date that arrived decades before conventional archaeological models expected it to, forcing a similar, smaller-scale reckoning within North American archaeology specifically. In northeastern Louisiana sits a site called Poverty Point, an enormous set of earthworks, including a series of 6 concentric C-shaped ridges nearly 3/4 of a mile across at their widest point, along with several substantial mounds, one of which, Mound A, rises roughly 70 feet high and contains an estimated 238,000 cubic meters of earth,
moved entirely by hand, using woven baskets, by a population with no draft animals, no wheeled transport, and, based on all current evidence, no agriculture to sustain a large settled labor force. Poverty Point's main construction phase is dated to roughly 3,700 to 3,100 years ago, considerably later than the core Younger Dryas period this documentary has focused on, and well within a period conventional archaeology already comfortably associates with sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies capable of monumental construction. So on its own, it's not quite as timeline-shattering as Göbekli Tepe. But it deserves inclusion here for a specific reason. It stands as clear, undisputed, mainstream accepted proof that a hunter-gatherer, non-agricultural society in North America, entirely independent of Old World developments, was capable of organizing labor on a scale rivaling early agricultural civilizations elsewhere in the world without ever adopting farming at all. The people who built Poverty Point were subsisting on fish, shellfish, and wild plant foods from the extraordinarily rich Mississippi River plainfield ecosystem, not unlike, in principle, the rich coastal and riverine resource base this documentary has argued may have supported comparable, still undiscovered sophistication on the drowned Ice Age coastlines many thousands of years earlier.
More strikingly still, and more directly relevant to tonight's central timeline, recent excavation and dating work at a site called Watson Break, also in Louisiana, pushed the origin of mound building in North America back even further, to roughly 5,400 years ago, meaning organized monumental earthwork construction by hunter-gatherer societies in the lower Mississippi Valley was already underway a full 1,000 years before Poverty Point's main construction phase, and thousands of years before agriculture became established in the region at all. And separately, ongoing excavation at White Sands National Park in New Mexico has produced a very different but equally paradigm-shifting kind of evidence: a trackway of fossilized human footprints preserved in ancient lakebed sediment that multiple independent radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence dating methods have placed at approximately 21 to 23,000 years old. Meaning, if these dates hold up to the ongoing scrutiny they have received, and so far, despite serious initial skepticism from several archaeologists, repeated independent dating attempts using different methods have continued to support the older date. Humans were present in North America several thousand years before the previously dominant model, which held that the earliest Americans arrived only around 13,000 to 16,000 years ago, either by an ice-free corridor through Canada or by a coastal migration route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway, following the resource-rich Pacific coastline southward by boat and on foot as the Ice Age ice sheets retreated.
Taken together, the White Sands footprints, the Watson Break and Poverty Point earthworks, the Clovis culture's abrupt disappearance, and the population genetics we discussed earlier, paint a picture of the peopling of the Americas that is considerably older, considerably more complex, and considerably less linear than the simple single migration across a land bridge story most of us were taught in school. Multiple waves of migration, potentially spanning many thousands of years and multiple different routes, arriving at different times, encountering an already changing megafauna population and an already volatile climate, appear to be a far better fit for the accumulating evidence than a single clean wave of first Americans arriving only once, all at the same time, by a single route.
And once again, the pattern holds. Every time North American archaeology has been forced to push its timeline further back, Clovis first giving way to pre-Clovis sites, pre-Clovis giving way to the White Sands footprints, it has done so reluctantly, under the weight of increasingly rigorous, increasingly hard to dismiss physical evidence, not because researchers were eager to find older dates, but because the older dates kept turning out, upon careful independent testing, to be real. If there is one consistent lesson running underneath this entire documentary,
it may be exactly this. Every generation of archaeologists has tended to assume the beginning of sophisticated human behavior sits somewhere just before their own generation's excavations, and every subsequent generation has, with some regularity, been forced to push that beginning further back than the last one believed possible.
Chapter 21. The Head in the Floor. Let's return to Anatolia and to the Taş Tepeler cluster we mentioned briefly a few hours ago, because the ongoing excavation there deserves more time than we gave it earlier. This is, right now, one of the most actively developing archaeological stories in the world, with new findings still being published as recently as the last couple of years, and it hasn't yet settled into the kind of fixed textbook narrative Göbekli Tepe itself now has. Karahan Tepe sits roughly 35 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, discovered initially in the 1990s during the same broad survey work that found Göbekli Tepe, but only receiving serious sustained excavation attention beginning around 2019 as part of a coordinated Turkish government initiative called the Taş Tepeler Project, bringing together multiple excavation teams to systematically investigate this entire cluster of sites simultaneously, rather than the slower, single-site approach that characterized Göbekli Tepe's earlier decades of work.
What excavators found at Karahan Tepe include structures that echo Göbekli Tepe's T-shaped pillar tradition, but also introduces genuinely new and, in some cases, more startling imagery. In one particular chamber, excavators uncovered a row of 11 phallic-shaped pillars projecting from a bench carved directly into the bedrock, alongside a large carved snake. In a separate chamber, researchers found something that has become one of the most striking single images to come out of this entire region: a human head, carved in naturalistic detail, recognizable individual features, rather than the abstracted symbolic style typical of the T-shaped pillars, emerging directly from a bedrock pillar shaped from the neck down like a standing human body, positioned so that the carved face looks directly upward, as though gazing toward the ceiling or toward the sky beyond it.
Necmi Karul, the archaeologist leading much of the Taş Tepeler project's work, has suggested that this figure, along with similar carved heads and phallic imagery found at the site, may represent an evolution in religious and symbolic thinking occurring across this cluster of sites over a span of centuries, a shift, over time, from the more abstract, animal-dominated symbolism of Göbekli Tepe's earliest phases toward increasingly explicit human representation, potentially reflecting a broader cultural shift in how these communities understood the relationship between humanity, ancestry, fertility, and the divine, as the practice of settled or semi-settled life and eventually early cultivation took hold across the region.
What makes the Taş Tepeler's cluster as a whole so significant, beyond any single carving, is the sheer scale it reveals once you stop looking at Göbekli Tepe as an isolated anomaly and start looking at the wider region as a genuine, interconnected network. As of recent survey work, more than a dozen major sites have now been identified across this relatively compact area of southeastern Turkey, many of them, like Karahan Tepe, only partially excavated, and several discovered specifically because ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys, conducted before any digging began, revealed likely subsurface structures, allowing archaeologists to target excavation with a precision that simply wasn't available to Klaus Schmidt when he first began working at Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s.
That's not an unsatisfying place to leave a story. It's actually the most honest, most respectful place a documentary covering material this genuinely unresolved can leave you, trusting you to hold uncertainty comfortably, rather than needing it resolved falsely, in either direction, before you're willing to find it interesting. Chapter 25. The Sea That Broke Through. There's one more flood story that belongs in this documentary, and it may be the single strongest piece of hard geological evidence connecting a specific, datable, cataclysmic flood event to a specific, still-told human myth, stronger in some ways than anything else we've covered tonight, because in this case, researchers have actually been able to map the drowned shoreline in detail and match its timing directly against the written record.
In 1997, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory published a detailed hypothesis based on sediment cores and seismic survey data collected from the floor of the Black Sea, arguing that the Black Sea had, prior to roughly 7,500 years ago, been a smaller freshwater lake, sitting well below the level of the adjoining Mediterranean Sea, its shoreline extending out across what is now submerged continental shelf, likely supporting agricultural and fishing communities along its fertile low-lying margins. Then, as global sea levels continued rising through the early Holocene, following the end of the Ice Age, the rising Mediterranean eventually breached a natural land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, near modern Istanbul. Ryan and Pittman's model proposed that this breach was not a slow, gradual trickle, but a genuinely catastrophic event, an enormous volume of saltwater pouring through the breach into the lower-lying freshwater lake basin at a rate they calculated could have raised the Black Sea's water level by as much as several inches per day, sustained over a period of many months, ultimately submerging an estimated 60,000 square miles of previously dry, likely inhabited lake margin land, and pushing the shoreline inland by as much as 90 miles or more in some areas.
Ryan and Pittman explicitly proposed that this event, a genuine, sudden, catastrophic, geographically confined flood of a magnitude and suddenness that any community living on the affected lakeshore would have experienced as an absolute, world-ending catastrophe, even though it did not affect the entire planet, could plausibly be the specific, real, geographically identifiable historical kernel underlying the Mesopotamian and, by extension, biblical flood traditions we discussed several hours ago, given the region's direct proximity and cultural connection to the areas where those written traditions first developed.
The Black Sea deluge hypothesis has, like nearly everything else in this documentary, generated genuine, ongoing scientific debate rather than uniform acceptance. Some subsequent research, including work led by geologist Liviu Giosin and colleagues, has argued the sea level rise in the Black Sea basin, while real and substantial, may have proceeded somewhat more gradually than Ryan and Pittman's most dramatic original estimates suggested, a period of years to a few decades, rather than a single catastrophic season, though still fast enough, on any human timescale, to represent an enormous and clearly memorable environmental catastrophe to the communities who lived through it, and who would have needed to permanently abandon fertile, previously reliable farmland within their own lifetimes. Oppenheimer's argument draws on several genuinely interesting threads. Genetically, some of the deepest, oldest branches of the human mitochondrial DNA family tree, associated with populations east of India, are found concentrated in island Southeast Asia, consistent with a long period of relatively isolated, in-place population development in this region during the Ice Age, before later migrations carried descendant lineages outward in multiple directions as sea levels rose and previously connected landmasses fragmented into separate islands. Linguistically, Oppenheimer pointed to certain deep, contested similarities between mythological motifs found in this region and mythological motifs found much further west, in the Near East and Mediterranean, arguing these similarities are better explained by a shared point of origin in a now drowned Sunderland homeland than by coincidence or independent invention,
though it's important to note that many linguists and folklorists have pushed back on specific comparative claims of this kind throughout the broader field of comparative mythology, precisely because motifs like floods, world trees, and creation from water are common enough independently across unrelated cultures worldwide that identifying a specific shared point of origin from surface-level similarity alone is notoriously difficult to do rigorously.
Oppenheimer's specific hypothesis has not been broadly adopted as mainstream consensus within professional archaeology or historical linguistics, and several of his more expansive later claims, tracing specific Near Eastern mythological elements directly back to a Sundaland point of origin, are regarded by specialists in those fields as considerably more speculative than the underlying genetic and sea level evidence alone would support. But the core foundational observation underlying his argument, that Sundaland was an enormous, resource-rich, likely well-populated landmass during the Ice Age, that its coastal and lowland regions were catastrophically and repeatedly flooded by the same sea level rise pulses we discussed earlier in this documentary, and that this flooding would have displaced, over a period of several thousand years, what may have been one of the largest concentrations of human population anywhere in the Ice Age world, is not fringe at all. It is well supported by mainstream geology and genetics, and it represents, along with Doggerland and the Persian Gulf Basin, one of the three major drowned homeland regions this documentary keeps returning to, because they may genuinely represent the largest gaps in our current archaeological knowledge of the Ice Age world. Vast regions of formerly habitable land, likely more densely populated than the marginal upland regions we've actually been able to excavate, sitting almost entirely unexplored beneath the modern sea.
Indonesian folklore itself, independent of Oppenheimer's specific academic framework, contains a genuinely striking number of local flood and lost land traditions tied to specific islands and specific now underwater features, echoing the same pattern we discussed earlier with Aboriginal Australian traditions preserving verifiable memory of pre-flood coastlines. Whether these traditions represent independently developed local flood stories, echoes of a broader shared Sundaland catastrophe passed down and reshaped over many thousands of years of subsequent retelling, or some combination of both, remains, like nearly everything else in this documentary, a genuinely open question rather than a settled one.
What is not in question, and what deserves to sit with you clearly, regardless of how the more speculative parts of Oppenheimer's argument eventually hold up? An area of land roughly the size of India, likely home to a substantial Ice Age population, was progressively drowned by rising seas over a period of several thousand years, fragmenting a single connected landmass into the scattered islands of the modern Indonesian and Philippine archipelagos. Whatever societies, whatever accumulated knowledge, whatever specific version of the human instinct to build, to mark the sky, to bury the dead with ritual, existed on that drowned continental shelf, is sitting today beneath some of the busiest, most heavily trafficked shipping lanes on Earth, essentially unexamined by modern underwater archaeology, waiting, like Doggerland and the Persian Gulf Basin, for the kind of dedicated, well-funded, systematic survey work that has so far only barely begun.
Chapter 23: The Other Humans Who Vanished. Before we bring this story home, it's worth widening the lens one final time. Because vanished is a word this documentary has used carefully, applied to specific coastlines, specific cultures, specific populations. But there is a deeper, stranger version of vanishing sitting underneath all of it, one written not in stone or myth, but directly into the genome of nearly every person alive today. And it deserves its own space before we close. For most of human prehistory,
Homo sapiens was not the only human species walking the earth. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia for several 100,000 years, a period vastly longer than the entire span of time modern humans have existed as a distinct population. They were not the shambling, low-browed brutes of outdated popular imagination. The archaeological record shows Neanderthals buried their dead, in some cases with apparent grave goods, used pigments, likely for symbolic or decorative purposes, made sophisticated tools well adapted to the environments they lived in, and at certain sites appear to have created cave markings and used eagle talons as jewelry, tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in the same regions.
Further east, an even more mysterious human population, the Denisovans, is known to science almost entirely through genetic analysis of a small handful of fossil fragments, a finger bone, a few teeth, a jawbone, recovered from a single cave in Siberia and a monastery site on the Tibetan Plateau, along with genetic traces recovered from cave sediment itself, without any accompanying bone fragments at all, a technique that has only become possible in the last several years, and that is likely to reveal considerably more about this population as it's applied to additional sites. We know astonishingly little about what Denisovans looked like, how they lived, or what they built, because so little physical evidence has survived or been found. We know with far greater confidence that they existed, because their genetic signature survives, clearly and measurably, in the DNA of modern human populations today, particularly and quite substantially in the DNA of Melanesian, Aboriginal Australian, and other Pacific and Southeast Asian populations, some of whom carry several percent Denisovan ancestry, a proportion far higher than the Denisovan contribution found in European or East Asian populations.
Both Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with modern humans repeatedly at multiple points in different regions, before eventually disappearing as distinct, separately identifiable populations, somewhere between roughly 40,000 and 30,000 years ago for Neanderthals, and at a broadly similar or perhaps somewhat later period for Denisovans, though the exact timeline for Denisovan disappearance remains considerably less well constrained, given how little direct fossil evidence exists.
Why they disappeared remains, like so much in this documentary, a genuinely open and actively debated question. Competing explanations include direct competition with expanding modern human populations for shared resources and territory, climate instability during this period placing additional strain on already small, genetically less diverse populations, and, increasingly, a recognition among researchers that disappearance may be, in a very real sense, the wrong word entirely. Neanderthals and Denisovans may not have been simply outcompeted and eliminated so much as gradually absorbed, interbreeding steadily, generation after generation, with expanding modern human populations, until the distinct genetic and cultural signature of these populations as separate, identifiable groups faded not through violent replacement, but through generations of intermixing, in much the same way a small tributary river doesn't disappear so much as merge indistinguishably into a larger one.
This matters to tonight's larger story for a very specific reason, and it's worth sitting with directly. Modern humans are not, and have never been, a single, unbroken, unchanged lineage stretching back in isolation to some single point of origin. We are, every one of us alive today, walking archives of multiple absorbed, vanished human populations, carrying, quite literally in our cells, the genetic legacy of at least 2 other human species that no longer exist as separate identifiable groups, but that did not, in the fullest sense, disappear without a trace either. Certain immune system genes that help modern humans respond to particular pathogens trace directly back to Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry,
inherited through these ancient interbreeding events and preserved by natural selection because they proved useful tens of thousands of years after the populations who originally carried them stopped existing as separate species.
There is something worth carrying with you from this, into the rest of tonight's story and beyond it. Vanishing across the entire span of human history, whether we're talking about a drowned Ice Age coastline, a population bottleneck following the Younger Dryas, or an entire separate human species merging into our own lineage tens of thousands of years earlier still, rarely means total, absolute erasure. It tends to mean something quieter and considerably harder to see clearly from a distance. Absorption, dilution, transformation, fragments carried forward, unrecognized, inside something that continues onward under a different name. The flood story that becomes Noah's story becomes, eventually, a bedtime story told to a child who has no idea it is one of the oldest continuously transmitted narratives our species has ever produced. A gene inherited from a Neanderthal ancestor, still quietly doing its job in an immune system 40,000 years later, in a person who has never once thought about where it came from.
Whatever specifically vanished 12,000 years ago, whatever coastline, whatever community, whatever fragile early tradition of monument building and star watching was lost to rising water or falling sky, it is worth holding on to the possibility, supported by everything else this documentary has shown you about how vanishing actually seems to work across the deep span of human history, that it did not vanish completely, that some thin, transformed, barely recognizable thread of it is very likely still here, still present, quietly folded into the deep background of whatever culture, whatever tradition, whatever story you yourself grew up hearing, without either of you ever knowing exactly where it first began. Chapter 24. What would change our minds? There's one more thing worth doing before we let this story settle fully into rest, and it's a slightly unusual chapter for a documentary like this one, but it matters. Let's talk plainly about what kind of evidence would actually resolve the open questions this documentary has spent so many hours sitting inside, rather than leaving them permanently, comfortably vague.
For Yonaguni, the question would be settled, in either direction, by the discovery of a clearly artificial object, a worked stone tool, a fragment of pottery, a carved artifact with unambiguous human manufacture marks, found in direct, undisturbed physical association with the formation, ideally recovered through a controlled, professionally documented excavation rather than an opportunistic dive. Absent that, continued detailed geological mapping of the surrounding, unquestionably natural sandstone formations in the region, comparing their fracture patterns directly against Yonaguni's disputed features, would help settle whether Yonaguni's geometry falls within or outside the range natural fracturing alone typically produces in this specific rock type. For Gunung Padang, the question would be settled by exactly the kind of evidence the retracted 2023 paper was criticized for lacking: physical, unambiguous artifacts, cut stone tools, worked material bearing clear tool marks, recovered directly from the deepest, most controversial layers, in a properly documented in situ context that rules out contamination or natural deposition, alongside independently replicated dating of that same material by multiple separate laboratories. For the Sphinx enclosure, resolution would likely require either the discovery of comparable, confidently dated structures from the same proposed earlier period elsewhere in Egypt,
establishing that a monument-building culture genuinely existed at that date. Or alternatively, a definitive geological study capable of fully ruling out the alternative weathering mechanisms proposed by Schoch's critics, something that has so far proven difficult given how many overlapping natural processes can plausibly produce similar surface erosion patterns in this specific type of limestone.
For the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, resolution would likely come from the discovery of an actual, confirmed impact crater of appropriate size and date beneath the North American ice sheet or in the surrounding region. A difficult but not impossible search, given that a promising subglacial crater candidate beneath Greenland's Hiawatha Glacier has in fact already generated considerable research interest and debate over the past several years regarding its age and its potential relevance to exactly this question. Though as of this recording, its precise dating remains disputed, and it has not been conclusively linked to the Younger Dryas event specifically.
And for the broader question, this entire documentary orbits whether genuinely sophisticated, organized human societies existed on the world's drowned Ice Age coastlines before or during the Younger Dryas. Resolution will most likely come, if it comes at all, exactly the slow, unglamorous way most of the real evidence in this documentary has come. Through patient, well-funded, systematic underwater and coastal shelf survey work, of the kind the Lost Frontiers Project has been conducting in the North Sea, expanded to the Persian Gulf, to Sundaland, and to other drowned continental shelf regions worldwide, gradually building a real, physical, artifact-based picture of what these landscapes actually contained, rather than relying on inference, myth correlation, and educated speculation, however careful and well-grounded that speculation might currently be.
We wanted to include this chapter specifically because it's easy, especially late at night, listening passively to a story like this one, to let genuinely open questions quietly harden into settled beliefs simply through repetition and the comfort of narrative closure. That's not what good evidence-based curiosity is supposed to do, and it's not the standard this documentary has tried to hold itself to across the last several hours. The honest, correct position on nearly everything discussed tonight is not, "we know this happened," and it is equally not, "this is nonsense, dismiss it." It is, instead, the considerably more interesting and more intellectually honest position of, here is what the evidence currently shows, here is exactly where that evidence runs out, here is precisely what specific new discovery would move the needle further in one direction or the other, and here is why nobody has found that specific piece of evidence yet, whether because it doesn't exist, because it hasn't been looked for properly yet, or because it's sitting under 40 meters of ocean water in a region that has never once been properly surveyed with modern equipment.
Chapter 28. The Hunters at the Edge of the Lake. Before we gather everything together into a single closing thought, there's one more real, physical, wonderfully specific sight worth sitting with, because it does something none of the more dramatic, more contested sights in this documentary can quite do. It lets us stand in genuine, well-documented, uncontested archaeological detail inside the actual daily life of a community living directly at the edge of the drowned world we've spent so many hours discussing tonight. Star Carr in North Yorkshire, England, sits today in ordinary, unremarkable farmland, but roughly 11,000 years ago, meaning its occupation began only a few centuries after the end of the Younger Dryas cold snap we discussed at length earlier tonight. It sat directly on the shore of a large post-glacial lake, at what was then the very edge of the landmass we now call Doggerland,
before that landmass was fully swallowed by the rising North Sea over the following millennia. Because the site was subsequently waterlogged and sealed under peat, an extraordinary quantity of organic material survived here, largely intact, that would have rotted away completely at almost any dry land site of comparable age, giving archaeologists an unusually rich, unusually specific window into exactly the kind of post-Younger Dryas coastal and lakeside community this documentary has spent so much time imagining more abstractly.
Excavations at Star Kar, carried out across multiple research campaigns from the 1940s through to a particularly significant and much more extensive project beginning in 2004, have recovered an extraordinary array of preserved material. Wooden platforms, among the oldest known carpentry structures in Europe, built out into the lake shallows, presumably to provide stable, dry footing and access to fishing and water resources, even as lake levels fluctuated seasonally. A wide array of bone and antler tools, including barbed points used for fishing and hunting, amber beads and a shale pendant, among the oldest decorated pendants found in Britain, engraved with a careful, deliberate pattern of lines whose exact symbolic meaning remains unknown, but whose obvious care and intentionality is not in question. And, most famously and most evocatively, a collection of 21 red deer skull frontlets, the upper skull and antlers of red deer carefully modified with drilled holes and thinned, lightened bone, apparently designed to be worn on top of a human head, quite possibly during ritual dances or ceremonies, quite possibly connected to hunting magic, transformation ritual, or some form of shamanic practice we can only partially reconstruct from the physical object itself.
Picture that scene directly, because it's real, physically documented, and dated with considerable precision. A community living at the literal edge of the drowning Ice Age world, building wooden platforms out into a lake that would itself, over the following millennia, become absorbed into the rising North Sea alongside the rest of Doggerland, wearing carved deer skull headdresses in what was very likely some form of ceremonial or ritual practice, carefully engraving small personal ornaments with deliberate, repeated patterns, at a settlement inhabited based on the evidence of repeated construction and rebuilding of the wooden platforms over time for what may have been several centuries of at least seasonal and quite possibly increasingly permanent occupation.
This is not a speculative reconstruction in the way our earlier single-day chapter explicitly was. This is documented, excavated, carefully dated archaeological fact sitting in the collections of the Yorkshire Museum and the British Museum today, available for anyone to go look at directly. And it matters enormously to tonight's story, because it closes the gap between the abstract, large-scale ideas this documentary has spent so many hours discussing: sea level rise, population bottlenecks, flood mythology, the possibility of sophisticated coastal communities lost to rising water, and a real, physical, unmistakably human moment. Real people with real names we will never know, standing at the edge of a lake that Doggerland's own slow drowning would eventually swallow along with everything else, wearing deer antlers on their heads, engraving small stones with patterns that meant something to them, building wooden walkways out over water that was already, slowly, permanently rising.
Whatever grander, more contested mysteries this documentary has walked you through tonight, Göbekli Tepe's pillars, the disputed geometry beneath the waves at Yonaguni, the retracted paper about the buried mountain in Java, Star Kar offers something quieter and, in its own way, more valuable. Proof beyond any reasonable dispute that this was a real, lived, richly detailed human world, populated by people who built, who decorated, who practiced ritual,
who cared for meaning beyond mere survival. Standing directly at the edge of the flood, this entire documentary has been circling for hours. The rest of that drowned world, spread out from Star-Kar's own lakeshore across the whole of what is now the floor of the North Sea, almost certainly held hundreds, if not thousands, of settlements just like it, most of which we will, in all likelihood, never excavate in anything like this level of detail, simply because they now sit considerably further out and considerably deeper beneath the modern seabed than the lucky, unusually shallow, unusually well-preserved conditions that allowed Star-Kar itself to survive intact long enough for us to finally find it.
Chapter 29. The Garden Beneath the Gulf. There's one more drowned landscape worth returning to before we close, because it has its own dedicated, peer-reviewed academic hypothesis attached to it, distinct from the general observations about Ice Age coastlines we made earlier, and it deserves the same careful attention we've given Doggerland and Sundaland. In 2010, archaeologist Jeffrey Rose, then at the University of Birmingham, published a detailed academic paper proposing what he called the Gulf Oasis hypothesis, the argument that the now submerged basin beneath the modern Persian Gulf, fed during the Ice Age by the combined outflow of the Tigris, Euphrates, and several other now vanished rivers, would have functioned as a large, stable, well-watered oasis refuge throughout the harshest, most arid millennia of the last glacial maximum, at a time when much of the surrounding Arabian Peninsula and the wider region was too dry and too cold to reliably support substantial human populations.
What makes this particular flood story different from the broader, more diffuse global flood mythology discussed earlier in this documentary is its specificity and its testability. Underwater archaeological survey work conducted in the Black Sea, including expeditions led by Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer famous for locating the wreck of the Titanic, has specifically searched the now submerged former shoreline for evidence of the human settlements this hypothesis predicts should be there, and has, in fact, recovered evidence of ancient submerged shoreline features and ancient wood consistent with the proposed timeline, alongside continued exploration for more definitive settlement remains.
This gives us something genuinely valuable to close this section on. A real, specific, geologically documented example of a sudden, localized, but genuinely civilization-altering flood, striking a real, well-populated ancient landscape at a real, datable moment, roughly 7,500 years ago, considerably later than the core Younger Dryas period this documentary has focused on, but operating by exactly the same basic mechanism on a smaller and more tightly documented scale. If a flood this sudden, this geographically confined, and this thoroughly forgotten by mainstream Western history until quite recently, could permanently reshape an entire regional coastline and very plausibly seed one of humanity's most enduring stories, it becomes considerably easier to accept as a matter of ordinary probability rather than speculative fringe theory, that the far larger, far more sustained, and far less thoroughly investigated flooding of Doggerland, the Persian Gulf Basin, and Sundaland during the preceding several thousand years did something broadly similar, on a considerably larger scale, to communities and traditions we simply haven't yet been able to identify and recover.
Chapter 26. The Machine That Shouldn't Have Existed. There is one final piece of evidence worth including in this documentary, and it comes from a period considerably later than the Younger Dryas. It has nothing directly to do with 12,000 years ago at all, but it earns its place here because it demonstrates something this entire documentary has been quietly building toward. That impossible, ahead-of-its-time technology, assumed by an earlier generation of scholars to be simply beyond the capability of the ancient world, has, at least once,
turned out to be real, verified, physically undeniable, and sitting in a museum where anyone can go look at it today. In 1901, sponge divers exploring a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of the small Greek island of Antikythera recovered, among various statues, coins, and pottery, a badly corroded lump of bronze that initially attracted little attention. Only in 1902 did an archaeologist examining the recovered artifacts more closely notice that the lump contained visible traces of gear wheels, an observation that, at the time, seemed almost absurd, since sophisticated geared mechanisms of this kind were not believed to have existed anywhere in the ancient world.
It took over a century of subsequent research using progressively more advanced imaging technology, ultimately including high-resolution X-ray computed tomography scanning conducted in the early 2000s, to fully reveal what the corroded lump actually contained. An extraordinarily sophisticated bronze mechanical device dated by its shipwrecked context and inscriptional style to somewhere around 100 to 150 BCE, containing at least 30 precisely cut bronze gears, some with teeth spaced at intervals of under a millimeter, organized into a complex geared system capable of modeling the movements of the sun and moon through the zodiac, predicting eclipses years in advance using a sophisticated mathematical cycle borrowed from Babylonian astronomy, tracking the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic and other Pan-Hellenic games, and accounting for the different lengths of the solar and lunar year through an early form of differential gearing not seen again in surviving mechanical devices anywhere in the world for well over 1,000 years afterward.
The Antikythera mechanism did not fit the model of ancient Greek technological capability that historians held before its true complexity was fully understood. It was not until scholars, including Derek de Solla Price in the 1970s, and later a dedicated international research team using modern imaging technology in the 2000s, painstakingly reconstructed its internal gearing, that the full scale of the achievement became clear. And even now, having fully mapped its mechanism, historians still cannot point to a clear, continuous tradition of comparably sophisticated geared mechanisms, either before or after it in the surviving ancient record. It appears, in the current evidence, remarkably isolated, either the product of a lost tradition of precision mechanical engineering that has otherwise vanished almost entirely from the historical and archaeological record, surviving in written references from ancient authors like Cicero to devices built by Archimedes that no longer physically exist, or an extraordinary singular achievement that was never widely replicated or preserved for reasons we don't fully understand.
We include the Antikythera mechanism here, at the close of this documentary, not because it has anything to do with the Younger Dryas or the specific 12,000-year timeline this story has focused on, but because it offers a clean, undisputed, scientifically verified proof of concept for the single idea this entire documentary has quietly asked you to consider from as many independent angles as we could responsibly offer, that the technological and organizational sophistication of ancient peoples is not something we can reliably estimate in advance from comfortable assumption, and that the actual physical evidence, when it does survive and when it is properly investigated, has repeatedly turned out to reveal capabilities considerably beyond what previous generations of scholars, working with the evidence available to them at the time, believed possible.
Göbekli Tepe did this for monumental architecture. The Antikythera mechanism did this for precision mechanical engineering. The White Sands footprints are, right now, doing something similar for the timeline of human presence in the Americas. Each of these cases required decades of patient, skeptical, rigorously tested archaeological and scientific work
before the impossible conclusion was fully accepted. And in each case, it was ultimately accepted not because someone found it exciting to believe, but because the physical evidence, examined carefully enough, for long enough, by enough independent researchers, simply left no other honest conclusion available.
That is, in the end, the single thread running underneath everything this documentary has walked you through tonight. Not certainty about any one specific vanished civilization, not a tidy single answer to what happened 12,000 years ago, but a well-earned, evidence-based humility about how much we still don't know, sitting directly alongside a well-earned, evidence-based confidence that whatever we eventually do find, buried under a Turkish hillside, corroded in an Aegean shipwreck, or drowned beneath a coastline no living person has ever walked, it is very likely to turn out to be more sophisticated, more interesting, and more surprising than the current comfortable assumption allows for. Chapter 27: The Formations Off the Cuban Coast. One more submerged site deserves a place in this documentary, both for its own sake and because it offers a useful final case study in exactly the pattern of hope, hype, and unresolved ambiguity this documentary has tried to walk you through carefully and honestly all night.
In the year 2000, a Canadian marine engineering company called Advanced Digital Communications, working under a Cuban government survey permit and led by ocean engineer Polina Zalitsky alongside her husband Paul Weinsweg, was using side-scan sonar to survey the seabed off the western tip of Cuba, near the Guanahacobibe Peninsula, originally searching for shipwrecks. At a depth of around 600 to 700 meters, considerably deeper than any of the other underwater sites discussed tonight, their sonar equipment recorded what appeared to be a cluster of large geometric structures, features described in subsequent reports as resembling pyramid-like shapes, along with straight lines and right angles, suggestive to the researchers involved of urban planning, spread across an area of several square kilometers on the ocean floor.
The team conducted follow-up dives using a remotely operated underwater vehicle, capturing video footage that showed large stone blocks with what the researchers described as smooth surfaces and unusual geometric arrangements. Zalitsky and Weinsweg, along with a small number of supportive researchers, proposed that these formations could represent the remains of an ancient pre-Columbian settlement, submerged by tectonic activity or catastrophic geological subsidence, potentially, in the most speculative versions of the claim that circulated in subsequent media coverage, tied to legends of Atlantis, though it's worth noting Zalitsky and Weinsweg themselves were notably more cautious in their own published statements than much of the surrounding media coverage was on their behalf, an important and common distinction throughout this entire subject area, where the original researchers' careful, hedged claim is frequently amplified into a considerably more sweeping, more sensational version by the press coverage that follows.
The scientific response was, as with several other sites discussed tonight, considerably more skeptical, and the specific objections raised are worth understanding clearly. The proposed depth of the site, roughly 600 to 700 meters below current sea level, presents an immediate and serious problem. Even accounting for the full range of Ice Age sea level change discussed earlier in this documentary, at its absolute lowest point, global sea level during the last glacial maximum was only around 120 meters below its current level, nowhere near the 600+ meters depth at which these formations sit. This means that if these structures are genuinely artificial, they cannot have been built as a coastal settlement subsequently drowned by rising post-glacial sea levels, in the manner this documentary has discussed for Yonaguni, Doggerland, or the Persian Gulf Basin.
They would instead require an entirely different, considerably more extreme explanation. Either an artificial structure built at a depth no known ancient technology could plausibly have reached in order to construct it in the first place, or a catastrophic large-scale tectonic subsidence event, sudden and severe enough to drop an entire settled landscape by over half a kilometer, an event of a scale and suddenness with no clear supporting geological evidence found anywhere else in the region.
Independent geologists who have reviewed the published sonar data and video footage have generally concluded that the formations are more consistent with natural volcanic or tectonic rock formations. The Yucatan and Western Caribbean region includes considerable underwater volcanic and fault activity capable of producing unusually angular, blocky natural rock formations at these depths without requiring any human involvement at all. No peer-reviewed geological survey has independently confirmed the site as artificial. No further major expeditions have been conducted since the early 2000s to clarify the ambiguous initial findings, and the site has, in the years since its initial burst of international media attention, largely receded from serious scientific discussion, without ever having been definitively resolved in either direction, neither confirmed as a genuine archaeological discovery through follow-up excavation, nor conclusively debunked through detailed independent geological survey. It sits unglamorously in a kind of permanent scientific limbo, a striking sonar anomaly, a round of excited media coverage, an absence of the sustained follow-up funding and research that would be needed to actually resolve it, and in the years since, a quiet fading from public attention entirely.
We wanted to close this particular thread of the documentary with the Cuban formations, specifically because they illustrate cleanly a pattern this entire subject area suffers from constantly, and it's worth naming directly, one final time, before we move toward closing the whole story. Genuinely striking, headline-worthy claims, generated from real but limited and ambiguous initial survey data, frequently receive an intense initial burst of global media attention, followed by the slow, expensive, unglamorous, and chronically underfunded work of actually verifying or disproving them, work that, in many of these cases, from the Cuban formations to Yonaguni to the deepest layers of Gunung Padang, has simply never been fully completed, for reasons ranging from funding limitations to difficult access and depth, to the site itself sitting in politically or logistically complicated waters. The result is a strange, cluttered landscape of dozens of maybe sites scattered across the world's oceans and coastlines. Real anomalies, real disputed sonar readings, real unresolved geological questions, very few of which will likely ever receive the kind of sustained, well-funded, definitive investigation that Göbekli Tepe eventually received on land, simply because underwater archaeology at meaningful depth remains, even today, dramatically more expensive, slower, and more technically demanding than equivalent work on dry land.
This is, itself, one of the quieter but more important takeaways from an entire night spent on this subject. It is not that the evidence for a sophisticated, lost prehistoric world is either overwhelming or absent. It's that the evidence, across dozens of individual sites worldwide, remains genuinely, chronically under-investigated relative to how significant the underlying question actually is. We have, as a species, spent immensely more money and effort searching the surface of Mars for evidence of ancient microbial life than we have spent searching our own planet's drowned Ice Age coastlines for evidence of our own species' lost history. That imbalance, more than any single specific unresolved site discussed tonight, may be the single most important thing to sit with as this documentary comes to a close.
Rose's argument draws on a specific and quite elegant piece of archaeological reasoning. Across the wider Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf region,
Archaeologists have long noted an unusual, difficult-to-explain gap in the human settlement record, spanning roughly from about 75,000 years ago down to around 8,000 years ago, during which very few sites show continuous, uninterrupted human occupation. Populations appear to have contracted sharply, retreated to a smaller number of refuge areas, and then, quite suddenly, around 8,000 years ago, an abundance of new settlement sites appears rapidly across the entire region, along the shores of the modern Gulf specifically, as though a considerable population had suddenly appeared from somewhere, fully formed, already adapted to coastal fishing, herding, and increasingly early agriculture.
Rose's proposed explanation is that this sudden population did not appear from nowhere at all. It had been there the entire time, sheltering for tens of thousands of years in the resource-rich, comparatively stable basin now submerged beneath the Gulf, protected from the worst of the Ice Age's aridity and cold by both the shielding effect of the surrounding mountains and the reliable, year-round fresh water supplied by the rivers draining into the basin. As global sea levels rose through the early Holocene, flooding the Gulf Basin progressively over a period of several thousand years, this sheltered population would have been pushed outward onto the surrounding higher ground, appearing in the archaeological record, the only record accessible to conventional land-based excavation, abruptly and in large numbers, precisely the pattern archaeologists have actually observed and long struggled to fully explain.
If Rose's hypothesis is correct, and it remains, like nearly every claim in this documentary, a genuinely debated rather than fully settled academic position, it would mean that one of the most historically significant regions on Earth, the region that gave rise, only a few thousand years later, to the first cities, the first writing systems, and the flood epic of Gilgamesh we discussed several hours ago, was seeded not by a population arriving fresh into an empty landscape, but by the descendants of a much older population that had spent tens of thousands of years developing in relative isolation, in a rich, sheltered basin that modern archaeology has almost no direct physical access to at all, because it now sits beneath one of the busiest shipping and oil extraction regions on the entire planet, making the kind of large-scale, systematic underwater archaeological survey that has begun, cautiously, in the North Sea and elsewhere, considerably more logistically and politically complicated to pursue here.
It is a quietly remarkable thought to sit with as this documentary moves towards its close, that the origins of Mesopotamian civilization, so often taught as the clean, well-documented beginning of history itself, the birthplace of the written word, of the first cities, of Gilgamesh's flood, may themselves rest on a foundation that reaches back, invisibly, into a drowned basin we have barely begun to investigate, populated for tens of thousands of years by people whose accumulated knowledge, whose own stories, whose own version of watching the sky and marking the seasons we know essentially nothing about directly, and may never recover in any detail at all, because the only place their world still exists is under the silt and salt water of a gulf now crossed daily by oil tankers, with almost none of it ever properly surveyed by an archaeologist. Civilization, in other words, even by its own most conventional, most textbook-friendly starting point in Mesopotamia, may not have begun in a true sudden beginning at all. It may simply be the first part of a much longer, much older story that happens to have left a written record we can still read, sitting on top of a considerably longer, considerably older chapter that never got written down because it ended gradually and then catastrophically under rising water before writing had been invented at all.
Chapter 30. What Remains After the Water Settles. We've covered a great deal of ground tonight. A staircase under the Sea of Japan. A hill in Turkey that broke a century of assumptions. A cold snap that may have come from the sky, or from a collapsing ice dam, or from both, arriving together within the same terrible span of years. Flood stories, told by strangers to each other on opposite sides of the world, describing in their own words, in their own gods, the same essential shape of loss. A retracted paper about a buried mountain in Java that we still don't fully understand. A statue in the Egyptian desert whose weathering pattern two respected geologists still cannot agree on. Genes carried quietly in the blood of people alive today, holding the faint, decodable echo of a population that mostly isn't here anymore. Vultures carved into 11,000-year-old limestone, still meaning roughly the same thing they meant to the builders of an Egyptian temple built 10,000 years later. Stones aligned to a sunrise that will keep arriving, correctly marked, long after everyone reading this sentence is gone.
None of this adds up to a single tidy answer. We told you honestly near the beginning that it wouldn't, and it hasn't. What it adds up to instead is something quieter, and in its way, more durable than a single dramatic answer would have been. Proof, repeated across a dozen separate lines of independent evidence, geological, archaeological, genetic, mythological, astronomical, that something significant, something we are still actively excavating, still actively arguing about, still actively discovering new pieces of even in the last few years, happened to the human species roughly 12,000 years ago. We are not looking at this from a position of total ignorance, the way earlier generations were. We are looking at it from somewhere in the middle of the investigation itself, close enough to see real shapes forming in the data, not yet close enough to see the whole picture clearly. There is something worth sitting with as you let this story settle and drift in the shape of what actually endured. Not the coastlines. Those are gone, permanently, sitting quietly under water that will not recede again on any timescale that matters to us. Not, in most cases, the people themselves, whose genetic lines were mostly succeeded over the following millennia by others. What endured, improbably, thinly, but undeniably, was the instinct itself, the specific human impulse to gather, to build something that would outlast a single lifetime, to carve a shape into permanent stone that would still be legible 10,000 years later, to tell a child a story about the water that came and took everything, so that the child would tell it to their own child, and so on, down a chain of telling so long that by the time it reaches a clay tablet in Mesopotamia, or a papyrus in Egypt, or a missionary's notebook recording an Aboriginal elder's account of a coastline that hasn't existed for 10,000 years, the original event is unrecognizable in its details, but somehow, still, unmistakably present in its shape.
That instinct is still here. It is, in its own way, the oldest continuously operating thing about us. Older than agriculture, older than writing, quite possibly older than Göbekli Tepe's first pillar, which was already, by the time it was raised, apparently drawing on artistic and symbolic traditions that had been developing for tens of thousands of years before it. Whatever specifically vanished 12,000 years ago, whatever specific coastline, specific community, specific tradition was lost to the rising water, or the falling sky, or the passing of a population that quietly wasn't replaced by its own children. The underlying impulse that built it in the first place did not vanish with it. It kept going. It went to Malta and built 1,000 years of temples with stone tools. It went to Egypt
and eventually raised something the whole world still recognizes on sight. It went to Britain and aligned 2 stones to a sunrise that keeps its appointment every single year without fail. It is, in some very real, very literal sense, the same impulse that made you curious enough to still be listening hours into this story as the details blur gently together and the weight of the day finally starts to lift from you.
Somewhere, right now, the tide is moving quietly over a shelf of seabed that was once, a very long time ago, dry land under an open sky. Somewhere on that shelf, something may be sitting that no one has looked at in 11 or 12,000 years. A shaped stone, a worked tool, the outline of a wall, patiently waiting under the dark, cold water, for the day someone finally comes looking with the right equipment, the right patience, and the right question. It isn't waiting anxiously. Stone doesn't wait that way. It will still be there next year, and the year after that, and probably long after any of us are here to keep wondering about it. For tonight, that's enough to know. The rest can wait until morning.